Welcome back to Naptime Knowledge. Take a breath in, slow and deliberate, and then let it go. Feel your body release with that exhale. Feel your shoulders drop. Feel your hands open. Feel the long, accumulated weight of the day beginning to soften at its edges, the way ice softens in warm water, gradually, inevitably, without drama. You do not have to rush this. There is nothing left tonight that needs doing. Whatever remains unfinished will wait for you patiently until morning, and you can pick it up again then, rested and clear-headed. But right now, the only thing asked of you is this: to breathe and to listen, and to let yourself be carried somewhere else. Tonight, we are not going quite as far back as some of our journeys. We are not crossing the Mediterranean to ancient Greece or sailing the Nile to the kingdom of the pharaohs. Tonight, we are going to a place that is, in some ways, very familiar. A place whose story you have likely heard fragments of since childhood, in classrooms and on holidays, and in the particular solemn pride that rises when certain words are spoken aloud. We are going to the founding of the United States of America. But I want to tell you that the founding, as a story, is far stranger and more human and more complicated and more surprising than the schoolbook version of it suggests. The men who made it were not marble statues. They were not perfectly wise or perfectly virtuous. They were afraid, frequently. They disagreed, constantly. They made mistakes that cost lives. They harbored contradictions so vast that the nation they built would spend the next 2.5 centuries trying to resolve them, and has not yet entirely done so. They were, in short, people, specific, flawed, brilliant, terrified, idealistic, practical, selfish, generous people, doing something that had never been done before, and not entirely sure it could be done at all. That uncertainty is what makes the story so alive. There was no guarantee. There was no predetermined outcome. At any number of points in the decades between 1763 and 1791, from the end of the French and Indian War to the ratification of the Bill of Rights, everything could have gone differently. The Revolution could have been crushed. The Confederation could have collapsed. The Constitution could have been rejected. The experiment could have failed. It didn't fail. And the reasons it didn't fail, the particular combination of ideas and circumstances and personalities and luck that held it together through the crises, make for one of the most extraordinary stories in the history of human self-governance. So let us begin. But first, as always, let us breathe. Find a comfortable position. Let your body settle completely into the surface beneath you. Feel the weight of your limbs, your arms, your legs, the back of your head, all of it held and supported. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to hold yourself up. Let your eyes close softly, or let your gaze go unfocused and easy. We are going to breathe together for a few moments before the story begins. Breathe in, slowly. Feel your chest and belly expand. Breathe in, 2, 3, 4. Hold, 2, 3, 4. Release, 2, 3, 4. Good. Let your jaw unclench. Let your brow smooth. Let the space behind your eyes go wide and soft. Breathe in. 2, 3, 4. Hold. 2, 3, 4. Release. 2, 3, 4. With this breath, set down the concerns of the day. Whatever you carried, whatever you planned, worried over, managed, forgot, you can put it down now. It will be there when you need it. Tonight, it can rest too. Breathe in. 2, 3, 4. Hold. 2, 3, 4. Release. 2, 3, 4. Notice how your body grows heavier with each breath. Notice how the room grows quieter. Notice how the breath moves through you like a slow river, unhurried, reliable, carrying you gently where you need to go. Breathe in. 2, 3, 4. Hold. 2, 3, 4. Release. 2, 3, 4. Let your breathing return now to its own natural pace. And as you breathe, let the words carry you back, across the water, across the years, to a world at once familiar and astonishingly different from our own. Chapter 1. The World Before Revolution. The 13 Colonies and their Grievances. To understand why the American Revolution happened, you need to understand something about the colonies before the Revolution, what they were, what they had built, and what they believed they deserved. By the middle of the 18th century, the 13 British colonies along the eastern seaboard of North America had been growing for more than 150 years. The oldest, Virginia, had been founded at Jamestown in 1607. The youngest, Georgia, had been established in 1732. Between them, from New Hampshire in the north to Georgia in the south, stretched a chain of settlements that had begun as fragile outposts clinging to the edge of a vast and largely unknown continent, and had grown into something more substantial, a population of roughly 2.5 million people by 1775, living in towns and farms and cities that would have been recognizable as civilized places by any European standard. Boston was a city of 15,000 people, its harbor busy with ships carrying fish and timber and rum to the markets of the Atlantic world. Philadelphia, the largest city in the colonies, had perhaps 30,000 residents and a cultural life sophisticated enough to support learned societies, newspapers, hospitals, and libraries. New York occupied the tip of its island with the air of a place that knew it was going places. Charleston, in South Carolina, was a prosperous port through which the produce of the plantation economy, rice, indigo, later cotton, moved to the world. The people who lived in these colonies were not a unified people. They spoke English mostly, but many also spoke German, Dutch, Swedish, French, and a dozen other languages. They were Anglican and Puritan and Presbyterian and Quaker and Catholic and, increasingly, simply indifferent to organized religion. They were farmers and merchants and lawyers and artisans and fishermen, and, in the southern colonies especially, the owners of large plantations worked by enslaved people of African descent. They were recent immigrants from England and Ireland and from Germany and Scotland, and they were families whose American roots went back 5 and 6 and 7 generations, who thought of themselves as Americans more than as Englishmen, though they would not have put it quite that way yet. What they shared across all this diversity was something subtler and more important, a habit of self-government. Every colony had a legislature, an assembly of elected representatives with the power to make laws and, crucially, to levy taxes. These assemblies were not perfect democracies. Most restricted voting to property-owning men, and the property requirement was sometimes substantial. But they were functioning institutions of representative government, and they had been functioning for generations. The men who sat in them, and it was men, had developed real political sophistication, real skill in the arts of argument and compromise and procedural maneuvering. They knew how to run things. They expected to be consulted. This expectation, the expectation of being consulted, of having a meaningful voice in the decisions that governed them, was the emotional core of what would become the Revolution. And it collided, in the years after 1763, with a British imperial policy that had very different ideas about who was in charge. The year 1763 matters because it is when the world shifted. The 7 Years' War, known in North America as the French and Indian War, had just ended, and Britain had won it spectacularly. France was expelled from Canada and from its territories east of the Mississippi. Britain was now the dominant power in North America. But the war had also been enormously expensive, and the British government, looking at its debts and looking at its colonies, came to a conclusion that seemed to it entirely reasonable. The colonies had benefited enormously from British military protection. It was only fair that they should help pay for it. This seemed reasonable in London. It seemed like something else entirely in Boston. The first major piece of legislation was the Stamp Act of 1765, a tax on paper goods of all kinds, legal documents, newspapers, pamphlets, even playing cards, all required to bear a revenue stamp purchased from Crown officials. It was not a heavy tax by European standards, but its passage by the British Parliament, without any consultation of the colonial assemblies, without any representation of colonial interests in Parliament itself, triggered a political storm that surprised everyone, including many of the colonists themselves. The phrase that emerged from this storm was simple and, once spoken, impossible to unsay. No taxation without representation. If Parliament could tax the colonies, and the colonies had no members in Parliament, then Parliament's authority over the colonies was, in principle, unlimited. There was no line it could not cross, no protection the colonists could rely on. The colonial assemblies had always controlled taxation. That control was not merely a practical convenience, it was the foundation of their liberty. To give it up, or to have it taken from them, was to become subjects in a much more absolute sense than they had previously been. The Stamp Act was repealed in 1766, partly because of colonial resistance, and partly because of economic pressure from British merchants who found the disruption of American trade expensive. But it was accompanied by the Declaratory Act, which stated flatly that Parliament had the right to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. The British government had backed down on the specific tax while explicitly refusing to back down on the principle. This pattern, concession on particulars, insistence on principles, would repeat itself several times in the decade that followed, and each repetition deepened the distrust on both sides. The Townshend Acts of 1767 imposed new taxes on imported goods, glass, paper, paint, tea. Colonial resistance, organized through non-importation agreements and the intimidation of royal officials, was fierce enough that most of the Townshend duties were eventually repealed, all except the tax on tea, which was kept precisely to demonstrate the principle of parliamentary authority. In March of 1770, a confrontation between a crowd of Bostonians and a small detachment of British soldiers resulted in the soldiers firing into the crowd and killing 5 people. The incident was immediately called the Boston Massacre, a characterization that required some rhetorical work, since what actually happened was more complicated than a massacre, and the engraving produced by Paul Revere, showing orderly ranks of soldiers firing into a peaceful crowd, was circulated throughout the colonies and became one of the most effective pieces of political propaganda in American history. It was not entirely accurate. It was enormously effective. The years between 1770 and 1773 were relatively calm, a truce of exhaustion in which both sides pulled back from confrontation without resolving anything. And then came the Tea Act of 1773, and with it the most dramatic single act of colonial protest, the Boston Tea Party. The Tea Act was, paradoxically, designed to make tea cheaper for the colonists. The British East India Company was in financial trouble, and the Tea Act allowed it to sell tea directly to the colonies, cutting out the middlemen and reducing the price even with the tax included. In London, this seemed like a solution. The colonists would get cheaper tea, the East India Company would be saved, and Parliament's right to tax would be quietly accepted without anyone really noticing. What actually happened on the night of December 16th, 1773, was that a group of Bostonians dressed as Mohawk Indians boarded 3 ships in Boston Harbor and threw 342 chests of tea, worth a considerable fortune, into the water. The Boston Tea Party was not a spontaneous mob action. It was carefully organized, partly by Samuel Adams and the Sons of Liberty, and it sent a message that the colonists intended to send loudly. We refuse. Not just this tax, the principle. We refuse to accept Parliament's right to tax us without our consent, and we will refuse, no matter how cleverly you package it. The British response, the Coercive Acts of 1774, called the Intolerable Acts by the colonists, closed Boston Harbor, suspended the Massachusetts colonial legislature, required colonists to house British troops, and removed certain legal protections. These measures were intended to punish Massachusetts and frighten the other colonies into compliance. They had precisely the opposite effect. They united the colonies in a solidarity that no previous crisis had produced, and they drove moderate voices toward radicalism. Men who had argued sincerely for patience and reconciliation began to wonder whether reconciliation was possible with a government willing to use such methods. It was in this atmosphere, of grievance accumulated over a decade, of principles hardened by conflict, of trust between colonists and crown shattered by the intolerable acts, that delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies gathered in Philadelphia in September of 1774 for the First Continental Congress. They were not yet talking about independence. They were talking about rights. They were talking about how to make their case to the king and to the British public. They were still, most of them, trying to find a way back to the relationship they believed they had once had with Britain, a relationship of mutual respect, of rights protected, of representation meaningful enough to justify loyalty. That relationship, as it turned out, was gone. It had perhaps never existed quite the way they imagined it. What they were trying to return to was partly real, and partly a story they had told themselves about what it meant to be British subjects in a free country. The story was about to be tested in a way that would reveal just how much of it was true. And across the Atlantic, a king and a parliament were making decisions that would determine whether the story survived. Chapter 2: The Road to Revolution. Lexington, Concord, and the Point of No Return. The night of April 18th, 1775, was cool and clear in Massachusetts. In Boston, the British military governor, General Thomas Gage, had received intelligence that the colonial militias were stockpiling weapons and military supplies at Concord, a town about 20 miles northwest of the city. He ordered a column of some 700 regulars to march quietly to Concord before dawn, seize the supplies, and return. The operation was to be kept secret. It was not kept secret. The colonial intelligence network in Boston, centered around a silversmith and patriot activist named Paul Revere, had been watching for exactly this kind of movement. When the troops began to mobilize on the evening of the 18th, signal lanterns were hung in the steeple of the Old North Church, one if by land, two if by sea, meaning whether the troops were marching across Boston Neck or crossing the harbor. And Revere rode out into the countryside, waking militia leaders and spreading the warning. He was eventually captured by a British patrol, but his message had already spread. By the time the regulars reached Lexington at dawn on the 19th, a company of militiamen was waiting on the green. What happened next is disputed, as it has been since the first accounts were written. The militiamen, perhaps 70 of them, facing 700 trained soldiers, were not there to fight. They seem to have intended to demonstrate their presence and then disperse when ordered. Their commander, Captain John Parker, apparently told them, "Stand your ground, don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." Someone fired. No one, then or since, has been able to establish who. The British regulars, startled, fired a volley. 8 militiamen were killed. 1 British soldier was slightly wounded. The colonists dispersed. The regulars marched on to Concord. At Concord, they found that most of the military supplies had already been moved. A smaller confrontation at the North Bridge left 2 Minutemen and 3 British soldiers dead. And then the British column began its march back to Boston, a march that turned into something very different from the ordered military operation that had set out the night before. The countryside of Massachusetts had had all night to prepare. Along the road from Concord to Boston, behind stone walls and trees, and the features of the familiar landscape that the colonial militiamen knew and the British regulars did not, men with muskets appeared and disappeared, firing and moving, appearing again further along the road. It was not the organized, disciplined combat that the British military was trained for. It was a nightmare of ambush and harassment, a running fight over 16 miles of road that cost the British column nearly 300 casualties before they finally staggered into Charlestown under the covering fire of naval guns in the harbor. The shot heard round the world. The phrase is Ralph Waldo Emerson's, written 60 years later, had been fired. The war had begun. The news traveled through the colonies faster than the British could have wished. Messengers rode, newspapers printed, and within days, communities from New Hampshire to Georgia knew that blood had been shed at Lexington and Concord. The effect was galvanizing. Men organized, militia companies drilled on village greens. A colonial army of sorts materialized around Boston, surrounding the British force in the city. And in May of 1775, the Second Continental Congress met in Philadelphia, this time facing a very different situation than the previous year's gathering. They were at war. Not officially, not legally. There was no declaration of war, and many delegates still hoped sincerely that the fighting could be stopped and some form of reconciliation achieved. But men had died. The British army was besieged in Boston, and someone had to take responsibility for the ragged force of colonial militia that had appeared around the city and whose commander had to be chosen, supplied, organized, and somehow led. The choice of commander, made in June of 1775, was George Washington, a Virginia planter and former militia colonel who had served in the French and Indian War, and who was known across the colonies as a man of unusual presence, dignity, and physical courage. He was not, at the time, anyone's idea of a military genius. He had never commanded a large army. His record in the French and Indian War had included both courage and significant failures. But he had qualities that were, in the particular circumstances of the American Revolution, more important than tactical brilliance. He was steady. He was honest. He was incorruptible. He inspired trust in the men who served under him and in the civilian leadership who would have to sustain a war that might last years. He also had a quality that would prove, in the end, to be perhaps the most important of all. He understood that his job was not merely to win battles. It was to keep an army in the field long enough for Britain to decide that the war was not worth winning, that the point was endurance, not victory, that if the Continental Army survived, the Revolution survived, regardless of how many engagements were lost along the way. This understanding would cost him enormously in the years ahead. It would require him to accept humiliations and defeats that other generals might have refused to survive. It would require patience of an almost supernatural kind. It would require watching men freeze and starve because the Continental Congress could not or would not provide what was needed. It would require keeping his own despair private and his public bearing steady and calm, because he was the symbol of the cause as much as its military leader, and a symbol that cracked would break the thing it represented. He was 33 years old when he took command. He would be 44 when the war finally ended. The decade in between would make him one of the most consequential human beings of the modern era. But before we follow him to the battlefield, we need to follow the political argument to its conclusion, because the army was fighting for something, and that something had to be named. Chapter 3. The Idea of Independence, Thomas Paine, Thomas Jefferson, and Common Sense. The argument for independence did not begin with independence. For most of the decade between the Stamp Act and the spring of 1776, the dominant political position in the colonies was not separation from Britain, but restoration of rights within the British system. The colonists wanted to be treated as British subjects, with the full rights that British subjects in England enjoyed. They wanted representation, or at least the principle of representation acknowledged. They wanted the right to govern their internal affairs through their own legislatures. They were not, in the main, arguing for a new country. What changed their minds was not a single event, but an accumulation of evidence. The intolerable acts, the shooting at Lexington and Concord, the burning of Falmouth and Norfolk by British forces, the King's formal proclamation in August of 1775, declaring the colonies to be in a state of rebellion, and a pamphlet. The pamphlet was called Common Sense. It was written by Thomas Paine, a recent English immigrant who had arrived in Philadelphia in late 1774, with little to his name except a letter of introduction from Benjamin Franklin and a fierce, clear, combustible mind. It was published in January of 1776, and within months it had sold an estimated 150,000 copies. In a country of 2.5 million people, many of them illiterate. It was read aloud in taverns and on village greens. It was reprinted and reprinted and reprinted. It was almost certainly the most widely read and most politically consequential piece of writing in American history. What Paine did in Common Sense was to take the political argument that had been conducted in the careful legal language of constitutional rights and translate it into something that any ordinary person could understand and feel. He did not argue that Parliament had exceeded its authority, or that the Stamp Act was inconsistent with the rights of British subjects. He argued that the entire system, monarchy, aristocracy, the inherited privilege of kings, was an absurdity and an offense against human dignity. He asked his readers to consider, with fresh eyes, the institution of kingship itself. Where did it come from? Scripture? No. Scripture was deeply skeptical of earthly kings, and Paine quoted it at length. History. History showed that kingship had produced more misery than it had ever prevented. Reason? Reason showed clearly that no man was so naturally superior to his fellows, that he was entitled to rule over them by virtue of his birth. The pamphlet was not a subtle document. Paine was not interested in subtlety. He wanted his readers to feel the absurdity, the injustice, the sheer unnaturalness of monarchy, and he hammered at it with a contempt that was deliberately designed to make comfortable deference feel shameful. He wrote of the king as a crowned ruffian. He wrote that a thirst for absolute power is the natural disease of monarchy. He did not argue for reform. He argued for abolition and for something new, something that had not existed in the world, or had not existed in the same form. A republic, a government of the people, by the people, for the people, rooted not in the accident of bloodlines, but in the consent of the governed. The effect of common sense on the political mood of the colonies was enormous and fast. Men who had been arguing for reconciliation found themselves, after reading it, wondering what exactly they had thought reconciliation meant. The argument for rights within the British system required believing that the British system was fundamentally sound, that it could be reformed, that the king was not the enemy, but a potential ally against a corrupt parliament. Paine dismantled this belief with a ferocity that was genuinely new in American political discourse. He made independence not merely a political option, but an emotional necessity. Not everyone was persuaded. Loyalists, and there were many, perhaps a third of the colonial population at various points in the conflict, found Paine's arguments dangerous and demagogic, a recipe for disorder dressed up in the language of liberty. The concerns of the Loyalists were not wholly unreasonable. What did independence actually mean? Who would govern? What would hold a collection of diverse, quarrelsome, self-interested colonies together if the tie of British allegiance were cut? These were serious questions, and the men who asked them were not all cowards or time servers. Some of them were principled conservatives who genuinely believed that what was being proposed was a leap into chaos. But by the spring of 1776, the political tide had turned decisively. Colony after colony instructed its delegates to the Continental Congress to support independence. The holdouts were the middle colonies, New York, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, New Jersey, where Loyalist sentiment was strongest and where the business and professional classes most depended on British trade and British connections. But even there, the pressure mounted steadily. On June 7, 1776, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia rose in the Continental Congress and moved that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. The motion was seconded. It was not immediately voted on. The middle colonies needed more time, but a committee was appointed to draft a declaration that could accompany the vote whenever it came. The committee consisted of 5 men: Benjamin Franklin of Pennsylvania, John Adams of Massachusetts, Roger Sherman of Connecticut, Robert Livingston of New York, and Thomas Jefferson of Virginia. Jefferson was 33 years old. He was a lawyer and a planter, a reader of extraordinary range, a man who had absorbed the political philosophy of the Enlightenment, Locke, Montesquieu, Rousseau, the Scottish philosophers, and made it in his mind into a coherent vision of what human government could and should be. He was not, by reputation, a great speaker. In debate, he was often quiet, preferring to let others argue while he thought. But he could write. He could write with a clarity and a music that none of his colleagues could match, and the committee knew it, and John Adams pressed him to take the primary responsibility for the draft. He worked on it for about 2 weeks in a rented room at the home of a bricklayer named Jacob Graff on the outskirts of Philadelphia. He wrote and crossed out and rewrote. He showed drafts to Franklin and Adams, who made small but important changes. And then he brought it to the Congress, which spent 2.5 days debating and amending and cutting, most painfully excising a passage that condemned the slave trade, which Jefferson had included, and which Georgia and South Carolina refused to accept. On July 4th, 1776, a date that has ever since been inseparable from the idea of American identity, the Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence. The vote was unanimous among the delegations, though not among the individual delegates. Several had reservations that they set aside in the interest of presenting a united front. The document was printed that night by the printer John Dunlap, and copies were dispatched by riders to commanders in the field, to colonial assemblies, and to the general public. It was read aloud in Philadelphia on July 8th to crowds who cheered. Washington had it read to his troops in New York on July 9th. In New York City, a crowd tore down the gilded lead statue of King George III that stood on the Bowling Green and melted it down, according to tradition, into musket balls. The break was made. There was no going back. Chapter 4. The Declaration of Independence. Words that changed the world. The Declaration of Independence is not primarily a declaration of independence. It is, before it gets to the actual declaration, something else. A theory of government, a philosophy of human rights, an argument compressed into a few hundred words of extraordinary precision and beauty about what legitimate political authority rests on and what people are entitled to do when that authority is abused. The theory begins with a claim that Jefferson called self-evident, meaning not obvious or uncontroversial, but rather requiring no further proof, foundational, the starting point from which everything else follows. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Every word of this matters. Created equal. Not equal in strength or wealth or intelligence or station, but equal in some more fundamental sense. Equally human, equally possessed of dignity, equally entitled to be treated as an end and not merely a means. Endowed by their Creator. The rights are not granted by the government, not established by law, not given by kings. They exist prior to and independent of any government, inherent in the nature of human beings as such. Unalienable, they cannot be given away, sold, traded, or legitimately taken. They belong to you not as a citizen or a subject, but as a human being, and no political arrangement can rightfully strip you of them. And then, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. This is the hinge on which everything turns. Governments exist to protect rights. Their authority comes from the people who consent to be governed. A government that violates rather than protects the rights of its people, that becomes destructive of these ends, forfeits its claim to obedience, and in that case, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government. This was not a wholly new idea. Jefferson drew heavily on John Locke, the 17th century English philosopher, whose two treatises of government had articulated a theory of natural rights and government by consent that was widely known among educated colonists. But what Jefferson did with Locke's ideas, the clarity with which he expressed them, the music of the prose, the way the logical structure led inevitably to the conclusion that followed, gave the ideas a life and a reach that Locke's more academic prose had never achieved. The Declaration then spends most of its length on a list of grievances against the king. 27 specific complaints about the ways in which George III had violated the rights of the colonists. The list is a lawyer's brief, assembled from a decade of colonial complaints, designed to demonstrate that the decision for independence was not rash or revolutionary, but the conclusion forced on the colonists by a sustained pattern of abuse. He has refused his assent to laws the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. He has dissolved representative houses repeatedly. He has obstructed the administration of justice. He has kept among us, in times of peace, standing armies without the consent of our legislatures. He has combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution. The document ends with the actual declaration that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved. And then the signers, the delegates of the Continental Congress who put their names to the document in the weeks that followed, pledged to each other their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor. This was not merely a rhetorical flourish. Signing the Declaration was, legally speaking, an act of treason against the British Crown, punishable by death. The men who signed it were not certain that they would not hang for it. Several of them would suffer severely for their commitment to the cause, losing property, health, family members. They knew what they were risking, and they signed anyway. It is worth sitting with that for a moment. The document was a statement of principles, but it was also an act of courage. The kind of courage that is quieter and harder than battlefield courage. The courage to put your name to something you believe in when the consequences are uncertain and the outcome is far from guaranteed. The words of the Declaration have echoed through history in ways that its authors both intended and could not have foreseen. Abraham Lincoln, standing at Gettysburg in 1863, described the Civil War as a test of whether the nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal could survive, invoking the Declaration to argue that the failure to extend its promises to enslaved Americans was a betrayal of the nation's founding ideals. Frederick Douglass, in his magnificent 4th of July speech of 1852, challenged his audience with the question of what the holiday meant to the American slave, drawing on the Declaration's own language to argue that slavery was a lie, lived at the heart of a country that claimed to believe in human equality. Susan B. Anthony cited the Declaration when she cast a ballot in 1872 and was arrested for it. Martin Luther King Jr. stood in front of the Lincoln Memorial in 1963 and described his dream in terms drawn directly from Jefferson's language, calling the Declaration a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. The words that Jefferson wrote in a rented room in Philadelphia in the summer of 1776 were greater than he knew. they were also, in a way that has haunted the country ever since, in contradiction with his own life. Jefferson owned more than 600 human beings over the course of his lifetime. He knew, with the part of his mind that was honest, that slavery was inconsistent with everything he had written in the Declaration. He wrote about it privately, with anguish and without resolution. He did not free his enslaved people in his lifetime. He did not champion the cause of emancipation in public after 1776. The contradiction between the words and the life is real, and it is one of the deepest wounds in American history, a wound that bled for nearly a century before it was partially addressed, and that has not fully healed even now. But the words endured. The words endured because they were true, because the claim that all human beings are created equal and endowed with unalienable rights is either true or it isn't. And if it is true, there is no limit to its application. Jefferson's words have been used by people he never imagined as weapons in struggles he could not have predicted against the very system of inequality that he himself participated in. This is one of the strange ways in which history works. The best of human ideals can outlive the limitations of the people who first articulated them and grow beyond what those people were capable of themselves. Breathe slowly now. Let those words settle into you the way they have settled into history. Slowly, deeply, in layers. We hold these truths to be self-evident. In the dark and quiet of the night, that is a remarkable thing to say. And we are still, all of us, living in the world those words made. Chapter 5. The war begins in earnest. New York, Trenton, and the Long Retreat. The Declaration was written in high summer. The war it declared was already going badly. When Washington took command of the colonial forces outside Boston in June of 1775, he found what he would find repeatedly over the next years, an army that existed more in spirit than in substance. The men were brave enough, most of them, but they were farmers and tradesmen and laborers, not soldiers. They had muskets of varying quality and condition. They had almost no artillery, no cavalry, no supply system, no discipline in the military sense. They came and went as they pleased, serving for a few months and then going home because there were harvests to bring in and families to support. The concept of a standing army, of professional soldiers who would commit to years of service, was something most Americans regarded with deep suspicion, associating it with the British Redcoats, whose presence had been one of the causes of the conflict. But Washington managed, in the early months of 1776, a genuinely brilliant piece of work. A young officer named Henry Knox, barely 25 years old, organized the hauling of 60 tons of artillery from Fort Ticonderoga, captured from the British in May 1775, over the mountains of New York and Massachusetts, 300 miles in winter, on sledges and boats and sheer stubborn will. The guns arrived in late January 1776 and were placed overnight on Dorchester Heights, the high ground overlooking Boston Harbor that the British had inexplicably failed to fortify. On the morning of March 5th, the British commander in Boston, General William Howe, awoke to find his entire fleet in the harbor, under the guns of an artillery battery, that had not existed the night before. He evacuated Boston within 2 weeks. The first major victory of the war was achieved without a battle. Then came New York and humiliation. Washington moved his army south after the British evacuation of Boston, anticipating correctly that New York would be the next British objective. It was obvious strategically. New York controlled the Hudson River, which provided the key north-south corridor of the continent, and a British army holding New York and controlling the Hudson could potentially cut New England off from the rest of the colonies and strangle the rebellion. The British arrived in late June 1776, the largest expeditionary force Britain had ever sent anywhere. More than 32,000 soldiers and sailors, the fleet alone stretching for miles across the harbor. Washington had perhaps 20,000 men, many of them short-term militia who were barely trained. The disparity was enormous. What followed, through the summer and fall of 1776, was a series of defeats that would have destroyed a less resolute commander and perhaps a less resilient cause. At the Battle of Long Island in late August, the British outmaneuvered Washington's forces and inflicted severe casualties. Washington managed to evacuate his army across the East River under cover of darkness and fog, a night operation of considerable skill. But the retreat continued, out of Brooklyn, out of Manhattan, across the Hudson and into New Jersey, pursued by British forces under Lord Cornwallis. By December 1776, the situation was as bad as it had been at any point in the conflict. The Continental Army had shrunk to fewer than 3,000 men. Illness, desertion, and the expiration of enlistments had reduced it from its summer strength. Many of those remaining were without shoes in the December cold of New Jersey. Tom Paine, who had marched with the army in its retreat, wrote the second of his crisis pamphlets, the one that begins with the sentence that became immediately famous. "These are the times that try men's souls," he continued. "The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country. But he that stands by it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered. Yet we have this consolation with us, that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph." Washington had the pamphlet read to his troops before the most desperate gamble of his military career. On the night of December 25th, 1776, Christmas night, Washington led his frozen, outnumbered, exhausted army across the ice-choked Delaware River in the dark, in a violent sleet storm that mixed with snow and hail, and attacked the Hessian garrison at Trenton, New Jersey at dawn on the 26th. The Hessians, German mercenaries hired by the British Crown, were taken completely by surprise. The battle lasted perhaps 45 minutes. Nearly 1,000 Hessian soldiers were captured. Not a single American was killed in the fighting, though 2 men froze to death during the crossing. Trenton was followed a week later by a victory at Princeton. Together, the 2 battles transformed the psychological situation of the war entirely. The great British Army, the most professional military force in the world, had been outmaneuvered and humiliated by a ragged colonial force that everyone had assumed was about to collapse. Enlistments surged, state militias mobilized. The cause, which had seemed very close to death, was alive again. The crossing of the Delaware is one of the most iconic images in American history. The famous painting by Emanuel Leutzer, showing Washington standing in the boat, his officers and soldiers around him, the river dark and dangerous, and like most iconic images, it simplifies and dramatizes. But it captures something real: the desperation of the moment, the audacity of the decision, the quality in Washington that made him, in the end, irreplaceable. He was not the greatest tactician of the war. He lost more battles than he won. But at the moments when everything could have ended, when a more cautious or more rational man might have concluded that the odds were simply too long, he found a way to go forward. That quality, call it will, call it faith, call it stubbornness, was what the revolution needed most in the winter of 1776. And Washington had it. Chapter 6. Saratoga, the battle that brought France into the war. Of all the battles of the American Revolution, the most strategically consequential was not Lexington and Concord, which began the war, or Yorktown, which ended it, but Saratoga, a series of engagements in upstate New York in the fall of 1777 that convinced France to join the war on the American side, transforming a colonial rebellion into a global conflict that Britain couldn't afford to win at any acceptable cost. To understand Saratoga, you need to understand the British strategy that produced it. The British High Command, in 1777, devised a plan to end the war quickly by cutting the colonies in two. A British army under General John Burgoyne would march south from Canada through the Lake Champlain corridor, capturing the Hudson River Valley and linking up with British forces in New York. The American colonies would be severed at the Hudson. New England, isolated, could be strangled. The southern and middle colonies, cut off from their most radical compatriots, might be more manageable. The plan was not unintelligent. It might even have worked if the coordination had been better, if the distances involved had been better understood, if the American forces had behaved as expected. None of these things were true. Burgoyne set out from Canada in June 1777 with an army of about 8,000 men, British regulars, Hessian mercenaries, Canadian volunteers, and a contingent of Indian allies. He moved slowly. He was encumbered by enormous quantities of baggage, personal baggage for the most part, because Burgoyne was a man of comfortable habits who saw no reason why campaigning in the wilderness should require him to forego his champagne and his four-poster bed. The army felled trees to build roads through the forests, fought off American militia attacks, and consumed its supplies at a rate that its commanders had not adequately planned for. By the time Burgoyne reached the area south of Saratoga in early September 1777, his army was already weakened, his supply line stretched to the breaking point, and the American forces opposing him, commanded by General Horatio Gates, with the field generalship handled in large part by the impetuous and brilliant Benedict Arnold, had been substantially reinforced. The first major engagement, the Battle of Freeman's Farm on September 19th, was tactically inconclusive but strategically significant. Burgoyne's army suffered more casualties than it could replace, while the American forces grew stronger as militia poured in from across New England and New York. For 3 weeks, the armies sat facing each other. Burgoyne waited, hoping for reinforcements that would not come, for cooperation from British forces in New York that would not materialize. On October 7th, he tried to break out, a reconnaissance in force that developed into the Second Battle of Saratoga at Bemis Heights. Benedict Arnold, who had been relieved of his command by the jealous Gates and was technically not supposed to be in the battle at all, rode into the fighting on his own authority and proved decisive, leading charges that broke the British line at the cost of a leg wound that would lessen his mobility for the rest of his life. 10 days later, on October 17th, 1777, General Burgoyne surrendered his entire army, approximately 6,000 men, to General Gates. It was the largest surrender of a British army since the English Civil War. The news reached Paris within weeks. Benjamin Franklin, the wisest and most sophisticated of American diplomats, who had been in France since late 1776, working to secure French support, had been making slow progress before Saratoga. France was already providing covert assistance to the Americans: money, guns, ammunition, supplies, all channeled through a fictitious commercial company established for the purpose by the playwright and adventurer Pierre-Augustin Caron de Beaumarchais, who is perhaps best known today as the author of the plays that became Mozart's The Marriage of Figaro and Rossini's The Barber of Seville. But open alliance, open war, was a different and much more dangerous commitment. Saratoga changed the French calculation. The Americans had demonstrated that they could fight, that they could defeat a substantial British army in a conventional engagement. The British had demonstrated that their strategy was vulnerable and that the war would not end quickly. France had its own reasons to want to embarrass Britain, the memory of the 7 Years' War still fresh, the opportunity to reverse the humiliations of 1763 still enticing. In February 1778, France signed a treaty of alliance with the United States, recognizing American independence and committing to enter the war. Spain followed in 1779 and the Netherlands in 1780. What had begun as a colonial rebellion was now a world war, with British forces stretched across 3 continents and unable to concentrate against any single threat. The harbor of New York had to be defended against a French fleet. Gibraltar had to be maintained against Spain. India had to be held against French naval power. The strategy of crushing the rebellion in America became just one item on a very long list. Burgoyne, when he returned to England after being exchanged as a prisoner, faced a parliamentary inquiry and the end of his military career. He became, somewhat unexpectedly, a moderately successful playwright. History has been less kind to him than to the officers who found excuses not to cooperate with his campaign. But he was, in fairness, the one who actually fought, which is more than can be said for several of his critics. Chapter 7: Valley Forge. Suffering, Survival, and the Making of an Army. The winter of 1777 to 1778 was, by any measure, the lowest point of the American war effort. the Continental Army went into winter quarters at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, a plateau about 20 miles northwest of Philadelphia, which the British had occupied in September. And what happened there over the next 6 months became one of the defining stories of American endurance. The numbers are not in dispute. Approximately 11,000 soldiers entered Valley Forge in December 1777. By February, more than 2,000 of them were dead of typhus, dysentery, pneumonia, and the cascade of diseases that malnutrition makes fatal. Hundreds more were unfit for duty, lacking shoes, blankets, or adequate clothing for a Pennsylvania winter. The supply system of the Continental Army was in a state of near total breakdown, the result of incompetent administration, financial chaos, and the predatory behavior of suppliers who preferred to sell to the British, who paid in hard currency, rather than to the American forces, who paid in continental paper money that was rapidly losing its value. Washington's letters from Valley Forge are among the most anguished documents in American history. A man who cared deeply for the soldiers under his command, watching them die for want of supplies that the Continental Congress seemed incapable of providing. He wrote of men going 3 or 4 days without bread, of soldiers sleeping on bare ground in winter because they had no blankets. He wrote that unless some great and capital change suddenly takes place, this army must inevitably be reduced to one or other of these 3 things: starve, dissolve, or disperse. And yet the army didn't dissolve. Men who had survived the crossing of the Delaware and the retreat across New Jersey found reserves of stubbornness they may not have known they possessed. Washington's presence, his personal visits to the sick, his evident suffering at their suffering, his refusal to leave camp for more comfortable quarters, mattered enormously to the morale of the force. And in February 1778, something remarkable arrived. A Prussian officer named Friedrich Wilhelm August Heinrich Ferdinand von Steuben. Steuben presented himself to Washington with a letter of introduction from Benjamin Franklin and the claim of being a lieutenant general in the Prussian army. The claim was somewhat inflated. He had been a captain and had left Prussian service under murky circumstances. But his military knowledge was real and his energy was extraordinary. He spoke almost no English. He drilled the troops in French, while an aide translated his instructions into English. And when his French ran out, he switched to German, which no one understood, and cursed magnificently. What Steuben did at Valley Forge was to take a collection of brave but untrained men and teach them to be soldiers. He worked with a model company of 100 men, drilling them in the movements that European armies used: the loading and firing of muskets in sequence, the wheeling of formations, the proper use of the bayonet, the disciplined advance and retreat. He worked with them personally, demonstrating the movements himself rather than delegating to subordinates. The model company spread the techniques to the rest of the army. By spring, the Continental Army could maneuver in ways it could not have managed the previous autumn. The combination of Steuben's training and the French alliance transformed the military situation. When the British evacuated Philadelphia in June 1778, shifting forces to meet the new French threat, Washington's army pursued them and engaged at the Battle of Monmouth Courthouse in New Jersey. The battle was tactically inconclusive, but the Continental Army performed in a way that would have been impossible at Valley Forge. They stood and fought on open ground, in formation, against professional British soldiers. They retreated in order when ordered, not in rout. They were, at last, something resembling the army Washington had been trying to build for 2 years. Valley Forge was not a battle. No shots were fired, no ground was taken. But it was, in some ways, the most important event of the war, the place where the Continental Army forged itself, in cold and hunger and suffering, into a force that could eventually win. Chapter 8. The War in the South, Guerrilla Warfare, and the Road to Yorktown. By 1778, the war in the North had reached a stalemate. The British held New York. Washington held the surrounding countryside. Neither side had the strength to dislodge the other. The British command, recognizing this, shifted its strategy. They would turn south, where loyalist sentiment was believed to be stronger, where they hoped to rally a large portion of the population to the Crown's side and use them to hold the territory their army seized. The Southern strategy produced dramatic early successes. Savannah, Georgia, fell to the British in December 1778. Charleston, South Carolina, the largest city in the South, fell in May 1780 in the worst American military defeat of the entire war. Approximately 5,000 Continental soldiers surrendered when General Benjamin Lincoln, surrounded and with no viable means of escape, capitulated to the British forces under Sir Henry Clinton. The loss of Charleston shattered the American military position in the South, and Congress sent Horatio Gates, the hero of Saratoga, to restore it. He managed instead, at the Battle of Camden in August 1780, to preside over one of the most catastrophic routs in American military history, losing nearly 1,000 men killed or captured, while personally contributing to the disaster by being among the first to leave the field. He rode 60 miles before stopping. What saved the American cause in the South was not the Continental Army, but the militia, and one man in particular, a brigadier general named Daniel Morgan, who had the gift of understanding, instinctively, how irregular warfare worked, and Nathaniel Greene, who replaced Gates in December 1780 and proved to be, arguably, the most intelligent strategic mind on the American side, other than Washington himself. Greene's strategy was not to win battles, but to exhaust the British. He divided his small army, a division he knew would have seemed suicidal to most conventional commanders, and sent Morgan westward, drawing the British forces under the aggressive General Banastra Tarleton to pursue. At the Battle of Cowpens in January 1781, Morgan laid a trap so elegant that military historians still study it as a masterwork. He placed his militiamen, troops whose unreliability in conventional battle was well established, in the front line, but with explicit instructions: fire 2 volleys and then fall back to the left. When the British charged, the militia fired their volleys and retreated exactly as planned. Tarleton's men, thinking the Americans were breaking, charged forward eagerly, and they ran directly into the Continental regulars that Morgan had placed behind the militia, supported by cavalry on the flanks. The militia, having retreated around the continental left, reformed and came back. The British force was surrounded. Of Tarleton's force of over 1,000 men, nearly 900 were killed or captured. Tarleton himself escaped on a fast horse. It was, in miniature, a kind of canny. Hannibal's great double envelopment of the Romans, studied by military officers ever since. After Cowpens, Greene continued his strategic retreat northward, drawing Cornwallis deeper into the interior of North Carolina, stretching his supply lines, fighting actions that inflicted casualties the British could not afford to replace, even when they technically won. At the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, in March 1781, Cornwallis drove the Americans from the field, but suffered such severe casualties, nearly a third of his force, that Charles James Fox in the British Parliament remarked that another such victory would ruin the British army. Cornwallis marched to Virginia in the spring of 1781, linking up with British forces operating there under the command of the most notorious traitor of the war, Benedict Arnold, who had defected to the British the previous autumn. His disillusionment with the American cause and his personal grievances against the Continental Congress having combined with a substantial bribe to produce one of history's most famous acts of betrayal. He was raiding Virginia with considerable effectiveness, burning supplies and disrupting the American war effort in the Chesapeake. But Cornwallis, marching his army into Virginia, was moving toward a trap he did not yet know was closing. Chapter 9. Yorktown, the battle that won the Revolution. The story of Yorktown is, at its heart, a story of coordination, of three separate forces from three different countries converging on a single point at exactly the right moment with exactly the right combination of capabilities. It almost didn't happen. It required a series of decisions, each made on imperfect information, each containing significant uncertainty, each depending on the others working out as hoped. That they all worked out is one of those moments in history where the word luck seems inadequate, but where the alternatives, fate, providence, inevitability, feel equally unsatisfying. Cornwallis, after his Virginia campaign, settled his army at Yorktown, a small town on a peninsula between the York and James rivers, in late summer of 1781. His position had the advantage of access to the sea, to British naval resupply, and, if necessary, evacuation. It had the critical disadvantage of being at the end of a peninsula, with water on three sides, and potentially an enemy on the fourth. Washington, in New York, had been watching events in Virginia with growing urgency. He had been planning, for much of 1781, a joint operation with the French army under the Comte de Rochambeau, which had been in Newport, Rhode Island since 1780, against the British in New York. The plan was abandoned when it became clear that a French fleet under the Admiral de Grasse was sailing north from the Caribbean and could arrive in the Chesapeake in time to support a southern operation instead. In August, Washington made a pivotal decision. He would abandon the New York plan entirely and march south, 1,200 miles, to trap Cornwallis at Yorktown. The march was accomplished in a movement of extraordinary speed, the American and French armies covering the distance from New York to Virginia in a month, leaving sufficient forces behind to maintain the fiction of a threat to New York long enough to prevent the British from deducing what was happening and reinforcing Cornwallis. Washington crossed through Philadelphia for the first time in years, and the city turned out to cheer. He was racing against the calendar. De Grasse's fleet could not stay indefinitely in American waters, and everything depended on the siege being completed before the French admiral needed to return to the Caribbean. The decisive moment came at sea, not on land. On September 5th, 1781, a British fleet attempting to relieve Yorktown engaged de Grasse's fleet in the Battle of the Chesapeake, sometimes called the Battle of the Capes. The engagement lasted only a few hours and ended without a decisive tactical victory for either side, but it was strategically absolute. The British fleet, unable to break through the French naval forces, withdrew to New York for repairs, leaving Cornwallis's army with no naval support and no means of evacuation or resupply. The British were trapped. The siege of Yorktown began in late September and proceeded with methodical efficiency. Washington's combined force, roughly 17,000 American and French troops, dug their trenches and artillery positions in the accepted European fashion, advancing their lines closer to the British fortifications in a sequence of parallel approaches. The French brought siege artillery of a quality the American forces had rarely possessed, and it was devastating. Alexander Hamilton, Washington's former aide, who had resigned in a quarrel with his commander and asked repeatedly for a combat command, led a successful assault on one of the key British redoubts on the night of October 14th, partly as an act of personal courage, and partly as a demonstration of what he was worth. By October 17th, Cornwallis's position was untenable. His fortifications were crumbling. His men were suffering. He sent a flag of truce. On October 19th, 1781, the British Army marched out of Yorktown to surrender. 8,000 soldiers, the second major British army to be captured in the war. Cornwallis himself claimed illness and sent a subordinate, General Charles O'Hara, to present his sword. Washington, in a mirror gesture of protocol, sent his own subordinate, General Benjamin Lincoln, who had surrendered at Charleston 18 months earlier, to receive it. The British band played a tune called "The World Turned Upside Down." Whether this was deliberate commentary or merely the most appropriate march they had available is a question historians have never definitively answered. But the title was apt. The world had, in significant ways, been turned upside down. A collection of colonial militiamen and farmers had, over 6 years of war, compelled the most powerful military force in the world to terms. Not by outfighting them, though there were individual battles where the Americans clearly outfought the British, but by surviving, by enduring, by refusing, through cold and hunger and defeat and despair, to stop. Yorktown did not immediately end the war. British forces remained in New York and elsewhere in America for more than 2 years, and peace negotiations dragged on until the Treaty of Paris was signed in September 1783. But after Yorktown, no serious British leader believed the war could be won. The political will to continue had been broken. Lord North, the Prime Minister who had directed British policy for a decade, resigned. The king contemplated abdication, The war was over in every way that mattered. Washington disbanded his army, without a mutiny, without a coup, without the seizure of power that history might have suggested was the natural outcome, and resigned his commission to Congress in December 1783. He returned to Mount Vernon. He was 51 years old, and he intended, he said, to live quietly as a farmer for the rest of his life. He did not, of course, but that is the next story. Chapter 10. The Articles of Confederation, the first attempt at a nation. Independence had been won. Now came the harder problem: what to do with it. The 13 colonies had, even before independence was declared, established some mechanism for cooperation in the Continental Congress. And in 1777, that Congress had adopted the Articles of Confederation, the first Constitution of the United States, which went into effect in 1781 after ratification by all 13 states. The Articles of Confederation were, in significant ways, a document shaped by fear. The colonists had just fought a revolution against a central government that they believed had accumulated too much power and used it oppressively. The last thing they wanted to create, in its place, was another powerful central government. The Articles reflected this fear at every point. They created a firm league of friendship among sovereign states. Not a nation in any strong sense, but a confederation of independent entities that agreed to cooperate on matters of common concern. The Congress under the Articles had no power to tax. It could request money from the states, but it could not compel payment. It had no power to regulate commerce between states, which meant that the states erected trade barriers against each other and competed in ways that often undermined the common interest. It had no power to raise an army directly. It depended on state militias. It had no executive, no president, no administration to implement its decisions. It could make treaties, but it could not enforce compliance. Any amendment to the Articles required the unanimous agreement of all 13 states, effectively impossible. In practice, the Confederation Congress was a body with broad responsibilities and almost no capacity to fulfill them. It could not pay its debts. The enormous war debt accumulated during the Revolution remained unpaid, and the soldiers of the Continental Army were owed back pay and promised land that the government could not provide. Foreign creditors had no confidence in American financial commitments. Foreign governments, Britain most notoriously, simply ignored treaty provisions that the American government was powerless to enforce. The British refused to withdraw from military posts in the Northwest that the Treaty of Paris required them to vacate, knowing perfectly well that the American government could not compel them to leave. And then, in 1786, came Shays' Rebellion, a series of armed confrontations in western Massachusetts, led by Daniel Shays, a Continental Army veteran, and a force of farmers who were facing foreclosure on their properties because of debts they could not pay in the hard money-only Massachusetts economy. The rebels prevented courts from sitting, attacked the federal arsenal at Springfield, and for several months months created genuine uncertainty about whether the government of Massachusetts, let alone the federal government, could maintain order. Shays' rebellion was suppressed, but the alarm it sent through the political leadership of the country was enormous. If a state government could not maintain order against an armed insurrection of its own citizens, and if the federal government could neither provide assistance nor prevent the outbreak, what was the Union actually worth? What held it together? What would prevent it from simply disintegrating into a collection of quarreling, unstable mini-states, easy prey for the European powers who were watching the American experiment with a mixture of skepticism and opportunistic interest? The answer that the leading minds of the country converged on through 1786 and into 1787 was this: the Articles of Confederation had to be replaced. The Union needed a real government with real powers, a government with the authority to tax, to regulate commerce, to enforce its decisions, to raise and sustain an army. A government, in short, that could actually govern. The Constitutional Convention that assembled in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787 was convened officially for the purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation. What it actually did was write a new constitution from scratch, and in so doing, it produced one of the most consequential documents in the history of human self-governance. Chapter 11. The Constitutional Convention. Compromise, Conflict, and the Frame of Government. 55 delegates gathered in Philadelphia in May 1787. They represented every state except Rhode Island, which refused to participate, having concluded that the convention was a conspiracy by the creditor class against the interests of ordinary people, a concern that was not entirely without foundation. The delegates included many of the most distinguished men in America. Washington, who presided; Franklin, now 81, who came in a sedan chair because he could no longer walk the distance; James Madison of Virginia, who had done more intellectual preparation for the convention than anyone else, and who would keep the most detailed notes; Alexander Hamilton of New York; Gouverneur Morris of Pennsylvania, who would draft the final text of the Constitution; and dozens of others who were lawyers, planters, merchants, and veterans of the political struggles of the previous decade. They agreed at the outset to keep their deliberations secret, a decision that was later controversial, but that was probably wise, since frankness in debate would have been much harder if every position taken could be reported to constituents before a final agreement was reached. Madison's notes, which are the primary record of the convention's proceedings, were not published until 1836, 4 years after his death. The debates were shaped by several major conflicts, each of which required a compromise without which the convention might have failed. The first and most immediate conflict was between large states and small states. The Virginia Plan, drafted primarily by Madison and presented by Edmund Randolph at the outset of the convention, proposed a bicameral legislature in which both chambers would apportion representation by population, giving large states like Virginia, Massachusetts, and Pennsylvania dominant influence. Small states, led by William Paterson of New Jersey, were horrified. They proposed instead the New Jersey Plan, which retained the one state, one vote structure of the Articles of Confederation. The two sides fought for weeks, with genuine uncertainty about whether agreement was possible. The resolution, the Great Compromise, or Connecticut Compromise, was proposed by the delegation from Connecticut and accepted with considerable difficulty in mid-July. The House of Representatives would be apportioned by population, satisfying the large states. The Senate would give equal representation to every state, 2 senators each, satisfying the small states. This structure has remained unchanged since 1787, and the equal representation of states in the Senate has shaped American politics at every point in the nation's history. The second major conflict was between slave states and free states, or more precisely, between the southern states, whose economies depended on enslaved labor, and the northern states, where slavery was either abolished or in the process of abolition. The conflict surfaced in several forms. Should enslaved people be counted for the purposes of apportioning representation in the House? The southern states wanted them counted. The northern states, with some justice, pointed out that if enslaved people were property, as southern law treated them, it was absurd to count them as persons for purposes of representation. The compromise, the 3/5 compromise, counted each enslaved person as 3/5 of a free person for purposes of both representation and direct taxation. It was a moral obscenity dressed in mathematical language, and it gave the slave states substantially more political power than their free population warranted, an imbalance that would shape American politics for the next 75 years. There were further compromises on slavery. The slave trade would be protected from federal interference until 1808, giving the states 2 decades to import enslaved people if they chose. The Fugitive Slave Clause required the return of escaped enslaved people even from states where slavery was illegal. These were not minor concessions. They were the price of Southern participation in the Union, paid in the currency of human beings' freedom, and the debt would eventually come due in the Civil War. The third major set of conflicts concerned the structure and powers of the federal government itself. How strong should the executive be? The delegates were deeply ambivalent about the presidency. Many feared a president who would become, in effect, a king, and the examples of history did not encourage confidence that executive power, once granted, would not be abused. The solution was to give the president substantial powers, command of the military, the treaty-making power, the appointment of judges and executive officers, while balancing those powers with congressional oversight and the power of impeachment and removal. The Electoral College, which was the mechanism for choosing the president, was a compromise between direct popular election and election by Congress, and it has been a source of controversy ever since. The question of the federal judiciary was resolved with considerable elegance. Article 3 of the Constitution created a Supreme Court and authorized Congress to establish lower federal courts, but left the details to Congress rather than specifying them in the Constitution itself. The power of judicial review, the ability of the Supreme Court to strike down laws as unconstitutional, is not explicitly stated in the Constitution, It was established by the court itself in the 1803 case of Marbury versus Madison. What emerged from the convention, after 4 months of debate in the summer heat of Philadelphia, was a document of remarkable concision, about 4,000 words, covering in 7 articles the basic structure of the federal government, the powers of each branch, the relationships between the federal government and the states, and the mechanisms for amendment and ratification. It was, as several of its framers acknowledged, an imperfect document, a compromise on virtually every point, satisfying no one's vision entirely, carrying within it the seeds of conflicts that would take generations to resolve. Franklin, in his closing speech to the convention, said he had come to doubt whether any other convention would have been able to produce a better document, and that he therefore consented to this Constitution with all its faults, doubting whether it was not the best he should meet with in his life. The Constitution was then sent to the states for ratification, requiring the approval of 9 of 13 to take effect, and it met in the ratification debates the most formidable opposition it had yet faced. Chapter 12. The Federalist Papers and the Fight for Ratification. The debate over ratifying the Constitution was the most serious and sustained discussion of the theory of government that American democracy has ever produced. The arguments made on both sides, Federalists who supported ratification and Anti-Federalists who opposed it, were often brilliant, and the Anti-Federalists' concerns have proven remarkably prescient in ways that are still relevant today. The Anti-Federalists were not simply reactionaries or defenders of local privilege, though some of them were. At their best, they were principled critics of concentrated power who drew on a deep understanding of history to argue that republics were fragile, that power corrupted, that a central government as strong as the Constitution proposed would inevitably become tyrannical. They pointed out that the Constitution lacked a Bill of Rights, no explicit guarantee of freedom of speech, religion, press, or assembly, no protection against unreasonable search and seizure, no guarantee of jury trial in civil cases. They argued that the federal government would swallow the states, that the president would become a monarch, that the Senate would become an aristocracy. These were serious arguments, and they resonated widely. Ratification was by no means certain, and in several key states, New York, Virginia, Massachusetts, the outcome was genuinely in doubt. The Federalist response was organized primarily by Alexander Hamilton, who recruited Madison and John Jay to write a series of essays explaining and defending the Constitution. The 85 essays that resulted, published pseudonymously under the name Publius in New York newspapers over the course of several months, are collectively the most important work of American political thought ever produced. They are both a defense of the specific Constitution and a general theory of Republican government, its possibilities, its vulnerabilities, and the mechanisms needed to make it work. Hamilton wrote 51 of the essays. Madison wrote 29. Jay wrote 5. The essays are uneven in quality, as one would expect from work produced at speed under political pressure. But the best of them are extraordinary. Madison's Federalist number 10 is perhaps the most important, an argument that the large republic, contrary to traditional republican theory, would be more stable than the small one, because a large republic would contain so many factions that no single faction could dominate and tyrannize the rest. This was a direct refutation of the received wisdom that republics could only function in small, homogeneous communities, a wisdom that the anti-federalists had cited as evidence that a continental republic was impossible. Hamilton's Federalist number 51 made the complementary argument about the internal structure of the government, that by dividing power among 3 branches, each with the ability to check the others, the Constitution created a system in which ambition would counteract ambition, in which the structural incentives of each branch would prevent the others from accumulating dangerous power. If men were angels, no government would be necessary. Hamilton, or Madison, the authorship is disputed, wrote, "If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. Framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself." The Federalist Papers are not comfortable bedtime reading. As a rule, they are dense and technical and demanding. But in the dark and quiet, with your body heavy and your mind beginning to drift, there is something in their seriousness that is itself soothing. The sense of people who took the question of how to govern themselves as seriously as any question can be taken, who brought every resource of intellect and learning and practical experience to bear on it, who disagreed fiercely and debated honestly, and produced, in the end, a framework that has proved, with all its flaws, capable of enduring. Ratification was achieved, state by state, through the spring and summer of 1788. Massachusetts, Virginia, and New York, crucial states whose absence would have crippled the new government, ratified with the understanding that a Bill of Rights would be added as amendments. Rhode Island, the holdout, finally ratified in 1790 by a margin of 2 votes, after the new government had already been operating for more than a year. Chapter 13. The Bill of Rights. Liberty Codified. The first Congress under the new Constitution assembled in New York City, the temporary capital, in the spring of 1789. George Washington had been unanimously elected president. John Adams, the second-place finisher in the Electoral College, became vice president. The new government faced immediate and substantial challenges, establishing the executive departments, creating a federal judiciary, establishing a system for generating the revenue the government desperately needed. There was enough work to occupy any legislative body for years. But James Madison had made a promise. He had committed, during the Virginia ratification debates, to working for a Bill of Rights, the explicit guarantees of individual liberty that the Anti-Federalists had identified as the Constitution's most dangerous omission. Some of his Federalist colleagues thought this was unnecessary, even counterproductive. Hamilton had argued in Federalist number 84 that listing specific rights implied that rights not listed might not be protected. but Madison understood something Hamilton perhaps underestimated: the symbolic and political importance of the commitment. If the new government was to earn the loyalty of those who had opposed it, it needed to demonstrate good faith. A Bill of Rights was the price of that good faith. Madison took the most than 200 amendments proposed by the state ratifying conventions and worked them down to a manageable list, introducing 17 amendments to the House in June 1789. The House and Senate negotiated the list down to 12. 10 were ratified by the required 3/4 of states by December 1791. These 10 amendments became the Bill of Rights. They are worth moving through slowly. The First Amendment, perhaps the most consequential single sentence in American law, prohibits Congress from making any law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. In a single sentence, the amendment protected religious liberty, both against an established church and in favor of free practice, and the freedoms of speech, press, assembly, and petition. These were not abstract principles. They grew directly from the colonial experience of having speech suppressed, presses censored, assemblies dispersed, and petitions ignored. The First Amendment was a commitment that the new government would not do to its citizens what the British government had done to its colonists. The Second Amendment protected the right of the people to keep and bear arms. Its precise meaning, particularly the question of whether the right is individual or tied to service in a militia, has been one of the most contested questions in American constitutional law, a debate that continues with great intensity today, and that the amendment's language, with its reference to a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, has not resolved to anyone's complete satisfaction. The Third Amendment prohibited the quartering of soldiers in private homes without the owner's consent, a direct response to the Quartering Act, one of the intolerable acts that had required colonists to house British troops. It is among the least litigated provisions of the Bill of Rights. The Fourth Amendment protected against unreasonable searches and seizures, requiring warrants supported by probable cause and describing with particularity the place to be searched and the things to be seized. The writs of assistance, general warrants allowing British customs officials to search any premise without specific cause, had been one of the great colonial grievances, and the Fourth Amendment was designed to prevent their American equivalent. The Fifth Amendment created some of the most important procedural protections in American law: the right to a grand jury indictment before being tried for a serious crime, the prohibition on double jeopardy, being tried twice for the same offense, the prohibition on being compelled to be a witness against oneself, the requirement of due process before being deprived of life, liberty, or property, and the requirement that private property not be taken for public use without just compensation. No person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. These words have been the foundation of an enormous body of constitutional law applied to situations the framers could not have imagined. The Sixth Amendment guaranteed the right to a speedy and public trial by jury in criminal cases, the right to be informed of charges, the right to confront witnesses, the right to compel the attendance of favorable witnesses, and the right to have the assistance of counsel. The Seventh Amendment guaranteed jury trial in civil cases. The Eighth Amendment prohibited excessive bail, excessive fines, and cruel and unusual punishment. The Ninth Amendment addressed the concern Hamilton had raised. The enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. Rights not listed were not thereby abandoned. The people retained rights beyond those specifically mentioned. The Tenth Amendment, the last and in some ways the most broadly consequential, reserved to the states and to the people all powers not delegated to the federal government or prohibited to the states. It was a final bow to the anti-federalist concern about concentrated power, a reminder that the Constitution created a federal government of limited and enumerated powers, not a national government of unlimited authority. The Bill of Rights was not immediately regarded as the foundational document it would become. For much of the 19th century, it was understood to apply only to the federal government, not to the states. A reading the Supreme Court confirmed in 1833. The transformation of the Bill of Rights into a broadly applicable guarantee of individual liberty against government power at every level was largely a product of the 20th century, driven by the incorporation of the Bill of Rights through the 14th Amendment's Due Process Clause. But the words were there, waiting to be used, refined, extended, a latent promise that generations of Americans would work to fulfill. Chapter 14. The First President, Washington, Precedent, and the Shape of the Republic. On April 30th, 1789, George Washington stood on the balcony of Federal Hall in New York City and took the oath of office as the first President of the United States. The crowd below cheered. Washington, by the accounts of those who were present, was visibly moved. A man not given to public displays of emotion, showing the weight of what he was undertaking. He was the only man in American history who would be elected president without genuine opposition, who would be chosen by unanimous vote of the Electoral College, because he was the only person whom virtually everyone trusted to hold the office without abusing it. He was also, in ways he understood very clearly, creating a presidency that had not existed before. Everything he did would set a precedent. Every decision about how the office should function, what the president could and could not do, what the proper relationship was between the executive and the other branches, was being made for the first time. There was no playbook. He approached this responsibility with a characteristic combination of humility and gravity. He wrote in his diary before the inauguration that he was entering on the execution of functions of a momentous nature, and that he felt himself in some degree overwhelmed by the magnitude of the charge. He asked Congress and the Cabinet for their views on matters of ceremony and protocol, recognizing that even the question of how to address the President, Your Highness, was suggested and rejected. Mr. President was settled on deceptively simple, would shape how the office was perceived. Washington's 2 terms in office, he served from 1789 to 1797, declining a 3rd term in a precedent that held for 150 years, established the basic patterns of the American presidency. He built the cabinet, the heads of the executive departments who would advise the president, and created a working relationship between the executive and legislative branches that navigated the genuine ambiguities of the Constitution's text. He established the practice of a presidential address to Congress. He managed the first major financial crisis of the new government, largely by deferring to his Treasury Secretary, Alexander Hamilton, whose financial genius created the institutions, a national bank, a funded national debt, a system of public credit that would undergird American economic growth for generations. He also set the precedent that proved, in many ways, the most important. He stepped down. After 2 terms, with his health declining and his patience with the partisan warfare that had developed between Hamilton's Federalists and Jefferson's Democratic Republicans exhausted, he returned to Mount Vernon. He did not seek a 3rd term. He did not attempt to rule by decree or to use the powers of the presidency to entrench himself in power. He went home. In his farewell address, not a speech but a newspaper essay published in September 1796, he warned his countrymen against 3 dangers that he believed threatened the Republic. The first was the spirit of faction, the bitter partisan divisions that had marked his 2nd term, and that he believed could, if unchecked, destroy the capacity for self-governance. The second was entangling alliances, permanent political commitments to foreign powers that would drag the country into conflicts not of its choosing and not in its interest. The third was sectional division, the growing tension between North and South, between slave states and free states, that he could see clearly even if the full depth of the wound would not be visible for another generation. He was prescient on all 3 counts. The partisan warfare he warned against has been a constant feature of American political life. The advice about entangling alliances was influential for more than a century. The sectional division would tear the country nearly apart within 70 years of his warning. Washington died at Mount Vernon on December 14th, 1799, at 67 years old, probably of a throat infection worsened by the medical treatment of the time, repeated bloodletting that would have weakened a much younger man. The country mourned in a way that it had never mourned before, and would not quite mourn again until Lincoln. His death marked the end of the founding generation's direct hold on the Republic. Henry Lee, in a eulogy that became immediately famous, described him as first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. The phrase was hyperbolic, as eulogies always are. But it captured something true about Washington's place in the founding. He was the indispensable man, the one person without whom the specific form the Republic took would not have been possible, the one person trusted enough by all parties to hold the center at every crisis. He was not a great intellectual like Jefferson or Madison or Hamilton. He was something rarer, a great character, a man whose integrity was absolute enough, whose ego was controlled enough, whose commitment to something larger than himself was consistent enough to allow the experiment to proceed. Chapter 15. The Legacy of the Founding. What they built and what they left unfinished. We have traveled a long way tonight, from the grievances of the Stamp Act to the Declaration's magnificent claims, from Lexington Green to Yorktown's surrender, from the failure of the Articles of Confederation to the ratification of the Constitution, from the debates over the Bill of Rights to the first presidency of George Washington. We have met visionaries and pragmatists, heroes and traitors, men of extraordinary gifts and men of extraordinary contradictions. We have watched a colonial rebellion become a nation, and a set of abstract principles become, gradually and imperfectly, a living government. Now, before sleep finds you completely, let us sit with the question that the whole story raises. What did they build? And what did they leave unfinished? What they built was genuinely new. The United States was the first nation in history founded explicitly on a set of philosophical propositions, on the claim that governments derived their just powers from the consent of the governed, that all men were created equal, that certain rights were unalienable. Previous nations had existed because of geography, ethnicity, dynastic inheritance, religious tradition, military conquest. America was different. It was, in Lincoln's later formulation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to a proposition. This was not merely rhetorical. The founders genuinely believed that what they were doing mattered beyond the borders of their own country, that if the experiment succeeded, it would demonstrate to the world that human beings were capable of governing themselves through reason and consent, without kings or aristocrats or established churches. They also built institutions of remarkable durability. The Constitution they drafted in 1787, with its separation of powers, its system of checks and balances, its federal structure dividing authority between national and state governments, has proved, with amendments and interpretive evolution, capable of governing a nation that the framers could not have imagined. A country of 300 million people, stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific to Hawaii and Alaska, with an economy of incomprehensible complexity and military power of global reach. The Constitution has been amended 27 times. It has been tested by civil war, depression, world wars, and the full range of political and social upheaval. It has not been overthrown. The peaceful transfer of power that Washington established in 1797 has been repeated without interruption, with one dangerous but ultimately unsuccessful attempt at disruption for more than 230 years. What they left unfinished was not small. The most glaring and most consequential unfinished business was slavery, the presence within a republic founded on the proposition of human equality, of an institution of absolute human inequality. The founders knew it. Jefferson knew it. Madison knew it. Washington knew it, and freed his enslaved people, though not his wife's, in his will. They deferred it, compromised on it, papered over it with the language of eventual resolution, and handed it to subsequent generations as the worst inheritance one generation can give another. A problem they understood, but lacked the will to solve. The Civil War was the price of that deferral. 600,000 dead, more Americans killed than in all other American wars combined, to resolve what the founders could not or would not resolve. And even after the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments abolished slavery and established, in principle, equal citizenship regardless of race, the work remained unfinished. The century of Jim Crow, of segregation and disenfranchisement and terrorism directed at Black Americans, was the continuation of the failure the founders had begun. The civil rights movement of the 20th century was the continuation of the argument the founders had started. The status of women, excluded from formal political participation entirely at the founding, their property rights severely limited, their legal identity subsumed in their husbands, was another enormous, unfinished piece of work, one that the words of the Declaration seemed to call into question from the moment they were written. Abigail Adams wrote to her husband, John, while he was in Philadelphia helping to frame the Declaration, to remember the ladies, to establish legal protections for women against the unlimited power of husbands, to give women a formal political role. John Adams replied with condescension and a joke. It took nearly 150 more years, and the sustained efforts of generations of women who took the founding documents at their word to achieve even the formal equality of the 19th Amendment. The treatment of Native Americans, the peoples who had lived on the continent for thousands of years before Europeans arrived, and who were dispossessed, displaced, and decimated in the centuries of expansion that followed, is a third enormous dimension of the founding's unfinished and often terrible business. The founders operated within a framework that largely denied the humanity and sovereignty of indigenous peoples, and the policies that followed their governance, removal, reservation, the deliberate destruction of cultures and communities, were among the darkest chapters of American history. These failures are real and they are profound, and we should not minimize them. The founders were not gods. They were not perfectly wise or perfectly virtuous. They were men of their time, shaped by the assumptions and limitations of their time, capable of seeing further in some directions than most of their contemporaries, and completely blind in others. And yet, the words they wrote were greater than they were. The principles they articulated, human equality, unalienable rights, government by consent, were true, and their truth did not depend on the consistency of the men who wrote them. The argument they started could not be contained by the limits they placed on it. It went on without them, and it goes on still. Elizabeth Cady Stanton opened the Declaration of Sentiments at Seneca Falls in 1848 with the words, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal." Frederick Douglass asked what the 4th of July meant to the American slave, and in the asking made the question of what America was and what it could be inescapable. Sojourner Truth stood at a women's rights convention in 1851 and asked, in plain and devastating language, "Ain't I a woman?" invoking a humanity that the founding documents had claimed to recognize and that the founding society had refused to honor. Martin Luther King Jr. stood on the National Mall and described the Declaration as a promissory note and demanded that the check be cashed. These people, and the countless others whose names are less famous, but whose lives and struggles were no less real, are as much a part of the founding story as Jefferson and Madison and Washington, The founding was not completed in 1791. It was begun. It was begun with words so powerful that they could not be contained by the people who wrote them, words that have been picked up and wielded by people who were excluded from the founding conversation, used as arguments in struggles the founders could not have imagined, advanced in directions that would have surprised and in some cases horrified the men who put them on paper. That is what it means to found something, to set down words that are true, and then have to live, and not manage to live, and have successors who try again to live, with the consequences of their truth. To make a promise, and then struggle, generation after generation, to keep it. The founding of the United States was not the completion of that promise. It was the making of it. The completion is the work of every generation since and of every generation to come. Chapter 16. The lives behind the history. The ordinary people of the Revolution. We have spent most of our journey in the company of the famous, Washington and Jefferson, and Hamilton and Madison, Franklin and Adams, the men whose names appear in the textbooks and on the monuments. But the Revolution was not made only by famous men. It was made by tens of thousands of ordinary people whose names are mostly lost to history, and whose lives were shaped by the great events we have been tracing in ways that the political history can only imperfectly suggest. Consider the soldier. The typical continental soldier was young, often a teenager, frequently a man in his early 20s. He was poor, or at least not prosperous. The wealthy and the well-connected often found ways to avoid service or to purchase substitutes. He served for pay that came irregularly, in currency that was worth less each month than the month before. He was cold at Valley Forge and hungry at a dozen other encampments. He marched long distances in shoes that wore out and were not replaced. He fought in conditions of smoke and noise and terror that no training could fully prepare a human being for. He watched his friends die of wounds and disease. He kept going somehow, for reasons that varied: pride, stubbornness, genuine commitment to the cause, fear of desertion's consequences, the simple fact that he had nowhere else to go. Many of these soldiers were not white men of European descent. African Americans served in the Continental Army from the beginning, initially excluded by Washington's early policy, then welcomed back when manpower shortages made exclusion impractical, and ultimately comprising perhaps 5,000 of the roughly 200,000 men who served in the Continental Forces at various points in the war. For some of them, service was motivated by the specific promise of freedom. Several northern states offered manumission to enslaved men who served. For others, the motivations were the same complex mixture as for white soldiers. The irony of fighting for liberty in an army that returned most of them to slavery at the war's end was not lost on them, and it was not lost on the more thoughtful white founders either. Women were present in the army in ways that the official military history long underemphasized. Camp followers, wives and daughters of soldiers who cooked, washed, nursed the sick, and carried water during battles, were a regular feature of 18th century armies on both sides. Some women disguised themselves as men and served as soldiers. Deborah Sampson of Massachusetts served for nearly 2 years before her sex was discovered. On the home front, women managed farms and businesses while their husbands were away, organized boycotts of British goods, manufactured clothing and supplies for the troops, and maintained the economic life of communities that had lost much of their male population. The Patriot cause was not the only side in the conflict, and the Revolution was, in some respects, a civil war, a violent disagreement among colonists about what they owed to the Crown and what the future of their communities should look like. Loyalists, some estimates suggest they were a third or more of the colonial population at the peak of their influence, were not merely passive bystanders. Many of them fought in loyalist military units raised and supported by the British. They were, in many communities, neighbors, business partners, family members of the Patriots, and the conflict between them had all the bitterness that civil strife between people who know each other personally always carries. After the war, most loyalists were stripped of their property and forced into exile, to Canada, to the Caribbean, to Britain, in one of the largest population displacements in American history. And then there were the people who were not clearly on either side, the majority perhaps of ordinary colonists who simply wanted to survive, to keep their farms, raise their children, carry on the commerce of daily life. They were buffeted by both sides. They were taxed by the Patriots and raided by the British. They fed soldiers of both armies and sometimes watched their crops and livestock disappear regardless of their political sympathies. For them, the Revolution was not primarily a philosophical event. It was an interruption of ordinary life that cost them enormously, and over which they had very little control. To understand the founding is to hold all of these people in mind at once. The statesmen drafting magnificent documents in Philadelphia, the soldiers starving at Valley Forge, the enslaved men and women whose labor sustained the economy of the southern colonies and whose humanity the Declaration simultaneously acknowledged and denied, the loyalists who lost everything, the ordinary people trying to survive. The story is bigger than any of its famous protagonists. It is the story of a whole society in the process of becoming something new, a process that was as painful and as uneven and as humanly complicated as such processes always are. Chapter 17. The Founders and Posterity, Their Hopes, Their Fears, and Their Questions for Us. As the founding generation aged and died, Adams and Jefferson on the same day, July 4th, 1826, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration. Madison, the last of the framers, in 1836. The others in between. They left behind not only the institutions they had built, but a set of questions they knew they were leaving unanswered. Would the Republic survive? They were not certain. Madison, in his old age, watched the gathering storm over slavery, with the despair of a man who understood that the wound he had helped paper over was still there, still bleeding, and who could see the direction it was heading. Jefferson's last letter, written 9 days before his death, spoke of the Declaration as a signal to arouse men to burst the chains and recover the blessings of self-government. But Jefferson's own life was an object lesson in the difficulty of living up to the documents one wrote. Adams, who had never owned enslaved people, and had found the institution repugnant since youth, looked at the question of slavery in American public life and wrote to a friend that it was a black cloud hanging over our country. Washington had freed his enslaved people in his will. Jefferson had not. The difference between them is not a comfortable one to sit with, and historians have spent considerable energy trying to understand it. What is clear is that both men knew what they were doing or failing to do, and that the moral weight of the institution sat on them differently, which tells us something about the limits of even the most admirable people when their material interests and their principles are in conflict. What would the founders have made of the country that grew from their beginning? It is a question easier to ask than to answer, because they disagreed so strongly with each other about nearly everything that any answer would only be partial. Hamilton would have recognized, would perhaps have taken satisfaction in, the industrial and financial colossus that America became, the global commercial power his economic policies helped set in motion. Jefferson would have found it horrifying. His ideal America was an agrarian republic of small farmers, not a nation of factories and cities and concentrated wealth. Madison would have looked at the partisan warfare of later centuries and found in it a confirmation of his most anxious warnings. Washington would have looked at the peaceful transfer of power again and again through the most divisive elections and felt something he allowed himself rarely: relief. They wanted, most of them, to be remembered. They wrote copiously for posterity as well as for their own time, aware that what they were doing mattered, that history was watching. Jefferson kept his papers with meticulous care. Adams wrote letters with one eye on the archive. Madison's decision to take such detailed notes at the Constitutional Convention was itself an act of awareness that these proceedings needed to be preserved for the judgment of history. But what they wanted, more than to be remembered, was to be proven right. To have the experiment survive. To have the proposition that human beings could govern themselves through reason and consent demonstrated as true rather than refuted by the collapse of the republic they had built. That anxiety runs through their correspondence in their later years. The fear that it would all come undone, that the factions would destroy what the founders had built, that the Union would split or the Constitution be subverted, or the liberties they had fought to secure be quietly surrendered. Those fears were not groundless. The Republic has faced existential crises, the Civil War most obviously, but also the Depression of the 1930s, and other moments of strain less dramatic, but no less real. Each time, what has held it together is not the genius of the founders, but the choices of subsequent Americans, to reform rather than abandon, to extend rather than restrict, to argue through the Constitution rather than around it, to hold to the proposition even when the gap between the proposition and the reality has been painful and obvious. That is the inheritance. Not a finished country, not a perfected system, not a set of answers, a set of questions framed with extraordinary precision by people who understood that they were not answering them, but only beginning the work. The question of what it means that all men are created equal. The question of what government owes to the governed and the governed owe to each other. The question of how a diverse, contentious, disagreeing people maintains a community that is genuinely free. These questions are not historical curiosities. They are the questions of every generation. They are the questions you inherit by being a citizen of a country that was founded on them. They are alive right now, argued over in legislatures and courtrooms and living rooms and newspapers and the 10,000 informal spaces where people try to figure out together what kind of community they want to live in. The founders started that argument. They did not finish it. They could not have finished it. That is not the kind of argument that ever finishes. Chapter 18. The Landscapes of the Founding. Places where history happened. History does not happen in the abstract. It happens in specific places, in rooms with particular light and particular temperatures, in fields with particular soil, along rivers with particular bends and currents. The places where the founding happened still exist, most of them, and they carry something of what occurred in them, the way old houses carry the residue of lives lived in their rooms. Not literally, not supernaturally, but in the way that physical spaces that have been the site of consequential human activity seem charged with it, seem to ask something of the visitor, seem to press the weight of what occurred there into conscious awareness in a way that books and documents alone cannot quite achieve. Independence Hall in Philadelphia, the Pennsylvania State House, as it was known at the time, is one such place. It is a modest building by the standards of great historical sites, a red brick colonial structure 2 stories high, flanked by wings, its interior cool and dim even in summer. The assembly room, where both the Declaration and the Constitution were signed, is a medium-sized chamber, smaller than you might expect, given what was done in it. The chairs are reproductions. Most of the furnishings are not original, but the room's proportions are original, and the light that comes through its tall windows is the same light that fell on Jefferson and Madison and Franklin and Washington as they argued and sweated and compromised through the hot Philadelphia summers of 1776 and 1787. To stand in that room, even crowded with tourists in July, is to feel the specific scale of what happened there. It was not a grand space. The men who shaped the Republic did not need a grand space. They needed a working space, a place to argue, to write, to cross things out and try again. The intimacy of the room is one of its most powerful qualities. You can imagine the actual voices, the actual arguments, the actual frustration, and the actual exhilaration of people who were doing something unprecedented and knew it. Valley Forge in winter is a different kind of place. The landscape is rolling and quiet. The Schuylkill River, visible from the higher ground. The woods where Washington's men cut timber for their huts, still standing. The reconstructed huts giving you some sense of what it meant to live in that space in the winter of 1777 to 1778. The cold at Valley Forge is not imaginary. You can feel it there, particularly in the early morning. And it is not hard to understand what it did to men who were already malnourished and poorly clothed. The monuments are discreet. The landscape does most of the work. Monticello sits on its hilltop above Charlottesville, Virginia, in a setting that Jefferson designed with the same obsessive aesthetic attention he brought to everything. The view from the West Lawn, looking out over the Virginia countryside toward the Blue Ridge Mountains, is one of the great American landscapes. Wide, layered, drenched in that particular quality of Virginia light that seems to come from slightly above horizontal and catch every leaf and blade of grass at the angle most likely to suggest the kind of pastoral perfection that Jefferson spent his life imagining and trying to build. The house itself is a masterpiece of self-invention. Jefferson rebuilt it repeatedly over 40 years, always adding features, always adjusting, always trying to make it express some new idea about how space and light and function should relate to each other. It is also, inseparably, a plantation worked by enslaved people. The dualism is part of the experience of visiting Monticello now, the beauty of the house and the grounds alongside the reconstructed slave quarters, the careful historical work that has tried to restore the full picture of who lived there and what their lives were. Jefferson's contradictions are not an embarrassing addition to the story of Monticello. They are the story, part of the complex human truth of the place. Mount Vernon, Washington's home on the Potomac, has a different quality, less intellectual than Monticello. Washington was not a philosopher king, and his house is more a working plantation than a statement of aesthetic and intellectual ambition. It feels more grounded, more practical, more the home of a man who was first and most naturally a farmer and a builder. The view across the Potomac from the east veranda is extraordinary. The river wide and quiet below, the Maryland shore on the far side, the same water that Washington's troops had to keep clear of British ships during the war. He sat on that veranda often in the last years of his life, watching the river. The battlefield at Yorktown is now a quiet park in Tidewater, Virginia, the earthworks still visible, worn down by 2 centuries but still clearly there, the lines of trenches still readable in the landscape, the British fortifications still showing their position in relation to the American and French lines. The town itself is a small colonial port, the old buildings still standing on the bluff above the York River. You can walk the siege lines and understand, in a way that maps cannot quite convey, the physical reality of what happened there. The compressing noose of the besieging army, the river at the British Army's back, the absence of escape. There is a moment at any of these founding places when the history becomes real in a way it is not when you read about it, when the scale and the specificity of the place impose themselves on your imagination. When you understand that this really happened, that these rooms were occupied by real people, that this ground was walked by real soldiers, that the decisions made in these spaces were made by human beings who did not know how things would turn out, who were afraid and uncertain and tired, and who did what they did anyway. That is perhaps the most important thing these places communicate. Not the grandeur of the founding, though the grandeur is real, but the humanity of it. The founding was done by people. People with bodies and fears and disagreements and personal grievances, and moments of genuine nobility and moments of failure. People who were, in the most essential ways, not so different from us. That is both a comfort and a challenge. A comfort because it means that what they accomplished was not beyond human capability, that the combination of circumstances and character that made the founding possible is not permanently unique. A challenge, because it means there is no excuse. If they could do what they did, build, under the most difficult circumstances, something new and something that has lasted, then the question of what we can do with what they built is not a historical question. It is a present one. Breathe into that question gently. You do not have to answer it tonight, but it is there, patient and alive, in the rooms and on the hilltops, and along the river bends where the founding happened and is still, in some essential way, happening. Chapter 19. The People the Textbooks Forgot. Women, the Enslaved, and the Indigenous in the Revolutionary Era. The traditional story of the founding focuses almost entirely on a small group of men, educated, propertied, white, most of them trained in law or politics, all of them moving through the same relatively narrow corridors of colonial and revolutionary public life. This is not a distortion in the sense of being untrue. Those men did make the decisions, write the documents, fight the battles and the arguments that shaped the Republic's form. But it is incomplete in ways that matter, because the Revolutionary era was experienced by a far larger and more varied population, and the experiences of those others, the women, the enslaved, the indigenous peoples, the poor and the itinerant, were no less real, no less shaped by the founding moment, and no less part of the full story. Women were present throughout the Revolution in ways that the official narrative has long undervalued. They were present in the economic boycotts that preceded the shooting. The non-importation movements required the cooperation of the households that women managed, since the imported goods being boycotted were largely goods that women purchased and used. The spinning bees that communities organized to produce homespun cloth in place of imported British fabric were organized by women and attended by women, and they were understood at the time as acts of patriotic sacrifice, as significant, in their way, as anything the men in the Continental Congress were doing. Mersey Otis Warren of Massachusetts was one of the sharpest political minds of the founding era, a writer and playwright whose satirical attacks on the loyalist figures of the period were widely read, and whose later historical writings about the Revolution remain valuable sources. She was also a committed anti-Federalist, worried about the concentration of power in the Constitution, and she was not shy about saying so in correspondence with the leading figures of the day, including John Adams. Her presence in the intellectual world of the founding was real, even if it operated largely through the informal networks, letters, conversations, that were the only avenues open to women in formal public life. Abigail Adams has become famous partly because her letters to her husband John have survived and have been published, and they reveal a woman of remarkable intelligence and directness who was fully engaged with the political questions of her day and not afraid to press her husband on them. Her admonition to remember the ladies is the most quoted line, and it deserves its fame. But it was part of a broader and more sustained engagement with the question of what the Revolution meant for the women of America, an engagement that John Adams's famous dismissive reply didn't end. She continued to think and write about these questions for the rest of her long life, and her letters constitute one of the most vivid and intellectually serious accounts of the founding era that exists. Phyllis Wheatley was an enslaved woman who had been brought from West Africa as a child and sold to a Boston merchant and his wife, who educated her, unusually, extraordinarily, and allowed her to write poetry. She published a book of verse in 1773 at 20 years old, making her the first African American and one of the first American women to publish a book. Her poems engaged directly with the themes of liberty and freedom that surrounded her, with an awareness of the irony of her own position, enslaved in a society increasingly celebrating liberty, that was pointed and painful and impossible to miss. She wrote a poem to George Washington that he acknowledged and thanked her for. She was manumitted after the death of her mistress. She died in poverty at 31, her later work mostly lost. Wheatley's brief life is a window into the experience of the enslaved population of revolutionary America, with a directness and specificity that the abstract fact of slavery cannot provide. The Declaration said that all men were created equal and endowed with unalienable rights. Phyllis Wheatley was, at the moment of the Declaration's signing, legally the property of another human being. The distance between the language and the reality was not theoretical. It was her life. The experience of the enslaved during the Revolution was more varied than either side in the founding myth would prefer to acknowledge. Many enslaved people attempted to use the disruption of the war to secure their freedom, running away, fighting with whichever side seemed more likely to free them, taking advantage of the chaos that attended armies on the march and towns changing hands. Lord Dunmore, the royal governor of Virginia, issued a proclamation in November 1775 offering freedom to enslaved men who would escape their patriot masters and fight for the British. Thousands did, perhaps 10,000 or more over the course of the war, making Dunmore's proclamation one of the largest emancipation events in American history before the Civil War. The response to this offer says something uncomfortable about what many enslaved people thought of the Patriots' proclaimed commitment to liberty. They chose the British. This does not mean the British were the friends of freedom. British officials had no intention of abolishing slavery. The institution was too valuable to the Caribbean colonies, which were the economic heart of the British Empire. Dunmore's proclamation was a military tactic, not a statement of principle, and many of the people who responded to it ended up in appalling conditions in British-controlled areas. But it reveals the perspective from which the revolution looked different, the view from the quarters and the fields, where the language of liberty being deployed by the white colonists had a bitterness to it that white colonists did not have to taste. The indigenous peoples of North America experienced the revolution primarily as a catastrophe, the beginning of an accelerating process of dispossession that had been underway since European settlement began, but that gained new force and new direction once an independent American republic was established. The British had, for their own reasons, tried to limit colonial expansion into the interior by the Proclamation of 1763, which prohibited colonial settlement west of the Appalachians. This restraint, imperfect, often violated but real, was one of the colonial grievances against the Crown. Once independence was achieved, there was no restraint at all, and the decades after the Revolution saw the beginning of the great westward expansion that would eventually drive the indigenous peoples from their ancestral territories east of the Mississippi. Many indigenous nations tried to navigate the Revolution by choosing sides, with varying results. The Iroquois Confederacy, which had maintained a delicate balance among its member nations and between them and the European powers for generations, was torn apart by the conflict, with the Mohawk, Cayuga, Onondaga, and Seneca mostly supporting the British, while the Oneida and Tuscarora largely supported the Americans. The result was internal warfare within the Confederacy that destroyed what generations of political wisdom had built, and the post-war treatment of all the Iroquois nations, regardless of which side they had supported, made it clear that the American Republic regarded indigenous peoples as obstacles rather than as neighbors with whom a lasting accommodation was possible. To tell the story of the founding fully is to hold all of this at once. The genuine achievements of the Declaration and the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and the lived experience of the people to whom those achievements were denied, or were irrelevant, or were actively harmful. Not to cancel one with the other, the achievements were real, and their later extension to broader populations was real. But to understand the founding as the complicated, contradictory human event it was, rather than the clean and heroic story that makes better mythology, but worse history. The people the textbooks forgot were there. They were part of the story. Their experiences are not footnotes to the founding. They are essential to understanding what the founding actually was, what it cost, and what it left undone. Rest with them tonight alongside the founders. The whole complicated human picture of the revolutionary era in all its beauty and all its failure, laid out across the dark of history like a landscape seen from altitude. The grandeur and the shadow both visible, both real, both part of what we have inherited. How a nation celebrates its birth. Every year, on the 4th of July, the United States holds what is in some ways the strangest national celebration in the modern world. Strange not because it is unusual to celebrate a national holiday. Most nations have them, but because of the particular quality of what Americans are asked to celebrate. Not a military victory, exactly, though the Revolution was one. Not the birth of a king or the reign of a dynasty. The 4th of July is the anniversary of an idea, of the moment when a group of men put their names to a document arguing that a certain way of thinking about government was right, and that it was right enough to die for. The celebrations have changed enormously over 2.5 centuries. The first 4th of July celebrations in 1777 involved cannon fire, bonfires, toasts drunk to the 13 United States, and public readings of the Declaration in city squares. The tradition of fireworks took hold early. They had been used for celebrations in the colonial period, borrowed from European practice, and has persisted ever since. The night sky lit in colors that Washington and Adams would have recognized, even if the scale is different. In the 19th century, the 4th became increasingly a day for oratory, for the great set-piece political speeches that were a primary form of American public culture in the age before mass electronic media. Politicians and clergy and civic leaders addressed audiences in public parks and town squares, and the occasion required a certain scope and elevation of language. The Declaration was read aloud, the deeds of the founders were celebrated, the principles of republican government were rehearsed and affirmed. It was civic religion in the most literal sense, a regular gathering of the community to profess its founding faith and renew its commitment to the principles on which the community was based. Frederick Douglass's July 5, 1852 speech in Rochester, New York, given the day after the holiday because he refused the easy comfort of simply joining the celebration, stands as the most searching American examination of what the 4th means, and to whom. He acknowledged the greatness of the founders unflinchingly. They were great men, their deeds were great deeds, their faith was great faith. And then he turned to the question of what the day meant to the American slave. He described the ringing of bells and the firing of cannon as a thin veil to cover up crimes which would disgrace a nation of savages. He told his audience that the distance between the founding promise and the American reality was not a minor discrepancy to be apologized for. It was a contradiction that the celebration of the 4th could not disguise. His speech did not reject the founding. It took it seriously in a way that the comfortable celebration did not. He held the country to what the Declaration actually said, and found the country wanting. That is a form of patriotism more demanding and more honest than the fireworks version, and it has been as important to the development of American civic culture as any more straightforwardly celebratory expression. The 4th of July parades that became standard in American towns and cities through the 19th and early 20th centuries brought the civic and the martial together. Politicians in carriages, veterans in formation, bands playing the music that had accompanied the Revolution and all the wars that followed, Sousa's marches, the battle hymn of the Republic, Yankee Doodle, originally a British song mocking the colonial soldiers, appropriated and turned into a national anthem of cheerful self-assertion. The music of the founding period was mostly borrowed or adapted from European sources, but it became, in the using, distinctly American, associated so closely with the particular celebrations and the particular occasions of American civic life that it now sounds, when you hear it, like nothing else in the world. The national anthem, the Star-Spangled Banner, written by Francis Scott Key in 1814 during the War of 1812, which was in some ways a second war of independence, a reaffirmation of American sovereignty against British pressure, was not officially adopted until 1931, which means the Republic existed for more than 150 years without one. Before it was official, Americans sang various patriotic songs. Columbia, the gem of the ocean. America, my country, 'tis of thee, set to the tune of the British national anthem, which is its own kind of commentary on the relationship between the two countries. The singing of these songs, the pledging of allegiance, the particular civic rituals that American school children perform from their earliest years. These are the practices through which the founding is transmitted from generation to generation, passed not as dry history, but as felt experience, as the particular emotion that comes when you stand in a crowd and sing something that everyone around you knows. These rituals are not neutral. They carry ideology, as all rituals do. The version of the founding they transmit has traditionally been a simplified and celebratory version. The cherry tree Washington, the wise and selfless founders, the straight line from declaration to freedom that skips over the complications. In recent decades, the teaching and the celebration of the founding have become more contested, as historians and educators have pressed for a fuller account that includes the stories of the enslaved, the indigenous, the women, the ordinary people who were present at the founding in ways the traditional narrative obscured. This contest over whose story gets told, in what terms and what conclusions it leads to, is itself a kind of founding argument, a disagreement about what America is and what it is for, conducted in the only way that such arguments can be conducted in a democracy, through speech and persuasion and the ongoing negotiation of a shared public culture. The 4th of July will come again this year, as it has come every year since 1776. The fireworks will go up, the grills will be lit, the speeches will be made, some of them eloquent, many of them formulaic, a few of them genuinely searching, and somewhere in a public square or a community park or a school gymnasium, someone will read the declaration aloud, and the words will land with whatever weight they carry in this particular moment, in this particular country, in the particular year it is. We hold these truths to be self-evident. In the dark and quiet of the night, those words are still true. They are still demanding. They are still asking us, as they have asked every generation since Jefferson wrote them, to do something with them, not just to celebrate them, but to live them, to close the distance, however small the increment, between the promise and the reality. That is the founding's final gift and its final demand. The celebration and the challenge are the same thing, and you cannot have one without the other. The intellectual world that made independence possible. The American Revolution was, among other things, a revolution of ideas. Before it was a military conflict, it was a philosophical argument, and the ideas that fueled it had been circulating in the minds and libraries of educated colonists for decades before the first shots were fired at Lexington. To understand why the revolution happened the way it did, why it produced a republic rather than a monarchy, a written constitution rather than a set of customary arrangements, a Bill of Rights rather than simply the residual privileges of victorious rebels, you have to understand the intellectual world the founders inhabited. The 18th century in Britain and its colonies was the age of the Enlightenment, a broad cultural movement that placed human reason at the center of the effort to understand and improve the world, that rejected traditional authority in favor of empirical investigation and rational argument, and that believed, with a confidence that later centuries would find somewhat naive, that the application of reason to human affairs could produce better societies, better governments, and better lives. The founders were children of the Enlightenment in the most direct sense. They read its canonical texts, argued about its central questions, and drew on its vocabulary when they set out to justify and design a new government. John Locke was perhaps the most immediately important influence. His two treatises of government, published in 1689 in the aftermath of England's glorious Revolution, provided the theoretical framework within which the American colonists made sense of their conflict with Britain. Locke argued that all people entered the world with certain natural rights to life, liberty, and property that existed prior to any political arrangement. Governments were created, in Locke's account, by a social compact among free individuals who agreed to surrender certain freedoms in exchange for the protection of their natural rights. A government that violated rather than protected those rights forfeited the consent on which its authority rested, and the people were justified in overthrowing it. Jefferson did not simply borrow from Locke in writing the Declaration. He transformed Locke's ideas, giving them a universality and a rhetorical power that Locke's more cautious prose had not quite achieved. Montesquieu, the French philosopher whose Spirit of the Laws appeared in 1748, was equally influential, particularly on the structure of the Constitution. His analysis of the English Constitution led him to conclude that political liberty depended on the separation of powers, the division of legislative, executive, and judicial functions among distinct institutions, each capable of checking and balancing the others. This insight, developed and refined by Madison and the other framers, became the foundational principle of American constitutional design. The three branches of the federal government, with their elaborate system of checks on each other's authority, are Montesquieu's intellectual legacy, as surely as they are Madison's political achievement. Scottish Enlightenment philosophy, the works of David Hume, Adam Smith, Francis Hutcheson, and their contemporaries shaped American thought in subtler, but no less important ways. Hume's skeptical empiricism influenced the founders' realism about human nature. They read his warnings about the tendency of popular governments to degenerate into faction and tyranny, and they designed institutions intended to channel rather than deny those tendencies. Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, published in 1776, the same year as the Declaration, provided an economic philosophy that resonated with the colonial merchants and planters who had long chafed under the trade restrictions of mercantile imperialism. Hutcheson's moral philosophy, with its emphasis on the moral sense common to all human beings, helped ground the Declaration's claims about self-evident truths in a broader philosophical tradition. The colonists also drew heavily on the tradition of classical republicanism, the study of Greek and Roman models of self-governance that had been revived in the Renaissance and was central to educated European and American political culture in the 18th century. The Roman Republic in particular was a touchstone. Its institutions, its ideals of civic virtue, its eventual corruption and fall were the subject of constant analysis and reference in the founding generation's writing and oratory. The pseudonym Publius, chosen by Hamilton, Madison, and Jay for the Federalist Papers, referred to Publius Valerius Publicola, one of the founders of the Roman Republic. The anti-Federalists wrote under names like Brutus and Cato, also Roman republicans, figures associated with resistance to tyranny and the defense of republican institutions against the ambitions of would-be monarchs. This classical reference was not merely decorative. The founders genuinely believed they were repeating, or attempting to repeat, the experiment of republican self-governance that Rome had attempted and eventually failed to sustain, and they studied Rome's failure with the anxious attention of students who expect to be tested on the material. Madison's Federalist No. 10, with its analysis of faction and its argument that a large republic might be more stable than a small one, was directly responding to the classical argument, most forcefully stated by Montesquieu, that republics could only function in small territories. Madison was rewriting the classical prescription, drawing on his reading of history to argue that the traditional wisdom was wrong. The printing press was the medium through which these ideas circulated, and colonial America had a remarkable press culture for its time. Newspapers were numerous and widely read. Pamphlets, like Paine's Common Sense, could reach enormous audiences quickly and cheaply. The colonial postal system, largely reorganized by Benjamin Franklin in his capacity as Postmaster General, made the circulation of printed material across the colonies practical. The result was a public sphere, a shared space of political argument and discussion that was, by the standards of the 18th century, unusually broad and unusually open. This does not mean that everyone participated in the intellectual world of the founding. Most colonists could not afford the time to read Locke or Montesquieu. Many could not read at all, but the ideas filtered down through sermons, through the speeches of colonial leaders, through conversation in taverns and on street corners, through the slogans and images of political propaganda. No taxation without representation is not a philosophical treatise. It is a phrase so compressed and so resonant that it could travel from a pamphlet to a broadside, to a tavern argument, to a protest on a street corner, carrying the essential content of a complex constitutional argument in 7 words. The genius of the founding generation, the thing that distinguishes them from mere political opportunists or military adventurers, is that they were both intellectuals and politicians, both theorists and practitioners, and they saw the connection between ideas and institutions clearly. They understood that the republic they were building would only survive if it was anchored in principles that people understood and believed in, and they worked constantly to articulate those principles in language that could be understood across the full range of colonial society. The Declaration, the Federalist Papers, Washington's farewell address. These are not just documents. They are acts of civic education, efforts to explain to the people what their government was for and what they owed to it, and it to them. That effort at explanation, the ongoing attempt to articulate the principles on which the Republic rests and to persuade each new generation to understand and commit to them, is itself a founding inheritance. It is, in some ways, the most important one. Chapter 20. The Revolutionary Diplomats. Franklin, Adams, and the World Stage. The American Revolution was won not only on the battlefield and in the Constitutional Convention, but in the salons and foreign offices of Europe. where a handful of American diplomats, men armed with the force of ideas and very little else, persuaded the most powerful governments in the world to take the American cause seriously. Benjamin Franklin arrived in France in December 1778 as the American minister plenipotentiary, which meant in practice the chief American diplomatic representative in Europe. He was 72 years old. He was the most famous American in the world. His experiments with electricity had made him a celebrity in European scientific circles. His Poor Richard's Almanac had been read across the continent, and his personality, wise, witty, unpretentious, possessed of an almost preternatural ability to make people feel at ease and appreciated, was perfectly suited to the French court and the Parisian intellectual circles he would inhabit for the next 9 years. Franklin understood something that more earnest diplomats sometimes miss, that the soft power of personality and reputation can do what formal argument cannot. He cultivated his image in France with deliberate calculation. He wore his fur cap and his plain coat at the glittering court of Versailles, presenting himself as the simple American philosopher, the embodiment of the natural wisdom of the New World, and the French nobility and intelligentsia adored him for it. His portrait was everywhere. Women named their hairstyles after him. Snuff boxes with his image on the lid were a fashionable accessory. He was not merely a diplomat. He was a symbol of the American experiment, of the Enlightenment ideal of the natural man of reason, of the possibility that the New World represented something genuinely new. He used this celebrity with great skill. He cultivated relationships with the ministers of the French government, particularly the Foreign Minister Vergennes, who was genuinely sympathetic to the American cause, but who needed political cover for the enormous commitment that open alliance with America would represent. He managed the flow of information from America to France, presenting the military situation in the best possible light without quite lying about it. He organized the covert supply operation that funneled French support to the American forces before the formal alliance was signed. And after Saratoga, he was in a position to press successfully for the open alliance that transformed the war. Franklin also spent years in Paris negotiating the Treaty of Paris of 1783, working alongside John Adams and John Jay in a diplomatic effort that achieved terms far more favorable to the Americans than anyone had reason to expect. The British were exhausted and wanted out. Vergennes was hoping to limit American territorial expansion, and the American negotiators, operating with considerable independence from their instructions, managed to secure recognition of American sovereignty over a vast territory extending from the Atlantic to the Mississippi River and from the Great Lakes to Florida, far more than the actual military situation would have suggested was obtainable. It was, as a diplomatic achievement, remarkable. John Adams's diplomatic career was somewhat more turbulent, less naturally charming than Franklin. He was direct, argumentative, easily offended, and had little patience for the social performances that diplomacy often requires. He was nevertheless one of the most effective American diplomats of the period, for the simple reason that he was tireless, meticulous, and brilliantly intelligent. As American minister to the Netherlands, he he secured both recognition of American independence and a crucial loan that provided the Continental government with desperately needed funds when other sources had dried up. He helped negotiate the Treaty of Paris, and as the first American minister to Great Britain, a position of some awkwardness, given that he was presenting himself to the court of the king against whom his country had just fought a successful revolution. He conducted himself with a dignity and a clear-eyed recognition of his difficult position that earned grudging respect even from those who found him personally abrasive. Adams later wrote that he served 3 wartime roles: as farmer, as statesman, and as soldier, though his soldiering was of the diplomatic variety. He meant by this that the pen and the negotiating table were as essential to the revolution's success as the musket and the cannon. He was right. Without French money, French ships, French soldiers, and the diplomatic groundwork that Franklin and Adams laid to secure French involvement, the military victory at Yorktown might never have been possible. The revolution was won on multiple fronts simultaneously, and the diplomats who fought it on the European stage were as essential to the outcome as the generals who fought it in the American countryside. Chapter 21. The Founding Debates. That echo still. Hamilton versus Jefferson, and the arguments we're still having. The founding of the United States settled some questions that had seemed impossible to settle. It did not settle all of them. Some of the most fundamental disagreements among the founders, about the proper scope of federal power, about the relationship between commerce and liberty, about what kind of economy and what kind of society America should be, were not resolved at the founding. They were embedded in the founding, like fault lines in rock, and they have defined American political debate ever since. The most fundamental of these disagreements was between Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. They disagreed about almost everything. They disagreed about the proper interpretation of the Constitution. They disagreed about economic policy. They disagreed about the French Revolution. They disagreed about what America was for and what kind of country it should become. Their disagreement produced the first American party system, Hamilton's Federalists against Jefferson's Democratic Republicans, and it established the basic terms of an argument that the Republican and Democratic parties of the 21st century are still, in recognizable ways, conducting. Hamilton's vision was of a commercial republic, a nation of cities and factories and banks and sophisticated financial instruments linked to the world economy by trade, governed by a strong national government capable of maintaining public credit, regulating commerce, and projecting power abroad. He looked at the great commercial empires of Europe, Britain most of all, and he saw what he wanted America to become: a manufacturing and trading nation, powerful, prosperous, urbanized, its government capable of mobilizing the collective resources of the nation for national purposes. Jefferson's vision was almost exactly the opposite. He looked at the great commercial empires of Europe, and he saw what he wanted America to avoid: concentrated wealth, dependent wage labor, corrupt politics bought by financial interest, cities full of the propertyless poor whose desperation made them easy instruments of demagogues. His ideal America was a republic of small farmers, independent, self-sufficient, rooted in the land, capable of self-governance precisely because their economic independence gave them the freedom to think and vote as they chose, rather than as their employers or creditors required. He feared banks, distrusted cities, and believed that the virtuous heart of America was the yeoman farmer on his own land, owing no man anything. Both of them were right about some things. Hamilton was right that a commercial and industrial economy would make America powerful, and he saw more clearly than Jefferson the direction in which the country was already moving. The financial institutions he built, the national bank, the funded debt, the system of public credit, laid the foundations for American economic growth in ways that Jeffersonian agrarianism couldn't have. Jefferson was right that concentrated economic power was a threat to political democracy, that the interests of the wealthy would tend to dominate a government that served them, and that the freedom of ordinary people required some protection against the power of capital. These concerns did not go away with the defeat of the Federalists. They became more acute as the industrial economy that Hamilton had envisioned produced the vast inequalities of the Gilded Age. The Jeffersonian-Hamiltonian debate echoes in every argument about the proper size and scope of the federal government, about the relationship between business and regulation, about whether economic growth or economic equality should be the primary goal of public policy. It echoes in arguments about states' rights and federal authority, about the interpretation of the Constitution, about the role of the Supreme Court. The founding didn't resolve these arguments. It started them with enough clarity and precision that we can still recognize them 230 years later as the same arguments. There were other founding debates that echo with equal persistence. The debate about the proper balance between security and liberty, between the government's need to maintain order and the individual's right to be free from government intrusion, runs from the founding through the Civil War and the Reconstruction Amendments and the World Wars and the Cold War, and the debates over surveillance and detention that followed September 11th, 2001. The debate about immigration, about who is entitled to become an American, what it means to be American, whether the identity is civic or ethnic or cultural or some combination, is as old as the Republic itself and as current as this morning's news. The debate about the role of religion in public life, about the proper interpretation of the First Amendment's establishment and free exercise clauses, about the relationship between religious conviction and political obligation was not settled at the founding, and it remains one of the most contested questions in American law and politics. The founders themselves disagreed about it. Jefferson's famous wall of separation between church and state was not the only view at the convention, and the states retained established religions in some cases for decades after the First Amendment's ratification. These are not failures of the founding. They are, in a sense, its greatest achievement: the creation of a framework, constitutional, institutional, cultural, within which these arguments can be conducted without destroying the community that conducts them. The miracle of the American founding is not that it answered all the hard questions. It is that it created a system robust enough to contain the arguments about those questions across centuries, through crises that seemed at times likely to break the system entirely without quite breaking it. That the system is still intact, imperfect, contested, strained, but intact, is the evidence that the founders built something that works. Chapter 22. The Memory of the Founding. How America remembers, forgets, and argues about its origins. Every generation of Americans has had to decide what the founding means, has had to take the documents and the events and the personalities of the revolutionary period and make sense of them in light of whatever present the country happens to inhabit. This has not been a stable process. The memory of the founding has been contested, revised, simplified, elevated, and complicated at every stage of American history, and those contests over memory have always been, at bottom, contests over the present, over what America is and should be, over who belongs and who is excluded, over what the founding promises, and to whom. The founders themselves began the process of constructing a usable founding mythology almost immediately. Washington, while he lived, was treated with a reverence that bordered on the religious, and after his death, largely through Mason Locke Weems's immediately popular biography, which invented the story of the cherry tree and established the template of Washington as a figure of impossible moral perfection. He became less a man than an icon. The Declaration of Independence, which had been a political document, became a sacred text. The Constitution, which had been a pragmatic compromise, became the supreme law of a secular religion. This sacralization of the founding documents and the founding figures served important purposes. A diverse and contentious country needed common symbols, shared references, a civic religion that could provide the kind of unity that ethnic or religious homogeneity provided for the nations of the Old World. The founding could serve this purpose precisely because it was rooted in universal principles rather than particular identities. Anyone could, in principle, claim the Declaration's promises as their own. But the sacralization also obscured. It made the founders into marble statues and the documents into perfect scriptures, when the founders were complicated human beings and the documents were products of political compromise. It made it harder to acknowledge the contradictions: slavery, the exclusion of women, the dispossession of indigenous peoples, that were built into the founding from the beginning. And it made the founding available to be used in ways that its authors would have recognized as distortions, as a conservative defense of the status quo, as though the founding were a finished achievement that later generations should preserve, rather than a beginning that they should continue. Every major American social movement has had to wrestle with the founding. The abolitionists of the early 19th century argued about whether the Constitution was a pro-slavery document. Garrison famously called it a covenant with death and an agreement with hell, or an anti-slavery document whose promises the nation had failed to keep. Frederick Douglass moved over the course of his career from Garrison's position to a different reading: that the Constitution, properly interpreted, was an anti-slavery document, and that the task was to hold the nation to what its own founding documents required. Lincoln made a similar argument in his great speeches, treating the Declaration not as a description of achieved reality, but as a standard to be approached, a goal toward which the nation was, imperfectly, still striving. The women's suffrage movement made an analogous argument. The founding document said all men are created equal. The women at Seneca Falls in 1848 changed the language to all men and women, making explicit what they argued was already implicit. They were not asking for something new, they said. They were asking for what the founding had already promised. This rhetorical strategy, appealing to the founding against practices that the founding had tolerated or enabled, has been one of the most powerful tools in American political reform. It works because the founding, for all its contradictions, did establish principles that genuinely are universal in their implications. Once you accept that all men are created equal and endowed with unalienable rights, the logic of that claim is hard to contain. It can be extended, has been extended by successive movements, to include those who were excluded at the founding. The Declaration's promise has been made good, partially and imperfectly, through 2 centuries of struggle by the people to whom it was originally denied. The debates over how to remember the founding are not merely academic. They shape current politics in direct ways. Whether the Constitution is read as a living document that should be interpreted in light of evolving social understanding, or as a text whose meaning is fixed by the original intentions of its framers, is a question that determines how courts rule on everything from gun rights to executive power to the meaning of equal protection. Whether the founding is remembered primarily as an achievement of liberty or primarily as an achievement of white male property owners is a question that shapes how American civic identity is understood and taught. Whether the contradictions between founding ideals and founding practices are acknowledged or minimized determines how honestly the country can reckon with the parts of its history that most challenge the official narrative of progress. The founding is not a settled matter. It is a living argument. It is a resource for those who want to invoke its principles to expand the circle of liberty, and for those who want to invoke its precedents to restrict it. It is a challenge to every generation to do better than the last, to close more of the distance between the promise and the reality, to make the proposition true in fact and not merely in language. That challenge is not ended. It will not be ended in your lifetime or your children's lifetime. The founding bequeathed it, and there is no finishing it, only the ongoing, imperfect, essential work of trying. And so we have come, gently and by a long road, to the end of tonight's journey. We have walked the streets of colonial Boston and sat in the humidity of Philadelphia's Congress Hall. We have crossed the Delaware in December darkness and huddled in the huts of Valley Forge. We have read the words that Jefferson wrote in a rented room and listened to the arguments that Madison and Hamilton made in the pages of newspapers, trying to persuade a skeptical public that a new kind of government was possible. We have watched Washington give up power and go home, and we have sat with the questions that the whole extraordinary project leaves open. The United States of America is an idea as much as a place, a proposition, as Lincoln said. And propositions are not self-evidently true unless their truth is continually demonstrated, continually argued for, continually lived toward. The founding documents are not museum pieces. They are living arguments, still being made, still being contested, still generating the debates that self-government requires and that free people cannot avoid. They were written by people who knew they were not enough, not wise enough, not virtuous enough, not free enough from the biases of their time and place to get everything right. They wrote them anyway, as well as they could, and trusted that those who came after would do better. The weight of that trust is not always easy to carry. Sometimes it feels impossibly heavy to be the inheritors of such magnificent words and such terrible contradictions, to live in a country that declared human equality and practiced human slavery, that proclaimed liberty and denied it systematically to women, to indigenous peoples, to black Americans, to the poor. The distance between the founding ideals and the founding reality was enormous, and it has not been fully closed even now. But the distance has been shortened by people who took the words seriously, who read the Declaration and said, "Yes, this applies to us," and went to work making it true. By soldiers who died to end slavery, and suffragists who were jailed to win the vote, and civil rights workers who stood in front of fire hoses because they believed that the proposition was true and that its truth required their witness. The story of America is not the story of a perfect founding. It is the story of imperfect people trying, generation by generation, to close the gap between the promise and the reality, and sometimes succeeding, and sometimes failing, and always having to try again. That is the American inheritance. Not a monument, but a task. Not a finished achievement, but an ongoing argument. Not a set of answers, but a commitment to keep asking the questions. Tonight you can set those questions down. They are too large for any single night, and they will wait for you, patient as stone, alive as fire, when you wake. The founders knew that. They built institutions designed to outlast their own lifetimes, designed to carry the argument forward through generations they could not see. What they built has carried it this far. What you carry it forward into is still being written. Breathe slowly now. Feel the weight of your body completely supported by the surface beneath you. Let your mind release its hold on the day, on the week, on everything that waits for tomorrow. Let the great story of the founding settle around you like a blanket. Not the simplified story of heroes and monuments, but the full, complicated, beautiful, painful human story of people trying to build something worth having out of the materials that history gave them. Out there, somewhere in the American night, the things they built are still standing. The documents are in the National Archives, under low lights, behind glass that filters out the frequencies of light that would fade the ink. The words are still there, still readable, still true in the ways they were true, still demanding in the ways they have always demanded. The courts are still hearing arguments in the morning. The legislature is still debating. The long work continues. Hamilton and Madison and Jefferson and Adams are long gone. Washington's Mount Vernon sits in the dark above the Potomac. The house still there, the fields still there, the river still moving. The Monticello hilltop catches the Virginia dawn every morning, as it has for 250 years. What they started you are living in. What they imagined, imperfectly, partially, with all the blindness that their time and place imposed on even their clearest vision, is still being built. And it is late. It is quiet. The questions can wait. Let your breathing slow. Let your body grow heavier. Let the dark behind your eyes deepen into something warm and still. This has been Naptime Knowledge. Thank you for crossing these extraordinary years with me tonight. You carry more history than you know, in the words you use, the rights you hold, the arguments you are free to make. Carry it gently into sleep. The founders are sleeping. The soldiers are sleeping. The great argument has gone quiet for the night, as it does every night before rising again in the morning, patient and inexhaustible and alive. Happy 250th birthday, United States of America, and happy 4th of July. Good night.